From the fool who dared mock a queen to the commoner who shaped Shakespeare's stage, this is a gentle yet surprising journey that we're about to embark on, lasting over 3 hours. We'll begin with how one reckless joke won a royal pardon and move deeper into how street comedy steered the birth of English theatre. So put your phone or television remote to the side, dim the lights, and please make sure to like the video, subscribe, and let me know where you are listening from in the comments. Now, let's begin. TRIBOULET. The year was 1515, and the chateau of Amboise glowed like a jewel against the Loire Valley's darkening sky. Inside the great hall, the last traces of the evening's feast lingered in the warm air, the sweet perfume of honeyed wine, the faint crackle of dying embers in the massive stone fireplace, and the gentle murmur of courtiers still savoring their king's hospitality. François had transformed his court into the beating heart of the French Renaissance, a place where Italian artists mingled with French nobles, where new ideas sparked like flint against steel, and where laughter echoed through corridors that had once known only the stern formality of medieval protocol. It was in this golden twilight of royal contentment that a peculiar figure made his entrance. TRIBOULET shuffled through the assembled nobility with the confident gait of a man who knew his worth, despitier perhaps because of his twisted spine and shortened limbs. His motley was a patchwork of brilliant colors that seemed to mock the somber velvets and silks of the courtiers around him. A cap adorned with jingling bells crowned his oversized head, and his eyes, sharp as a hawk's, missed nothing as they swept across the room. But it was not TRIBOULET's appearance that made the court hold its breath. It was his tongue, razor-sharp and utterly fearless, that had earned him both fame and infamy throughout the kingdom. Where other men bowed and scraped before their betters, TRIBOULET stood tall, metaphorically speaking, and spoke truths that would have sent lesser men to the scaffold. He possessed that rarest of medieval privileges, the fool's license to speak without consequence, to hold up a mirror to power and reveal its flaws through laughter. The king loved him for it, though love and terror often walked hand in hand at the Renaissance court. François first, young and proud, with dreams of glory dancing in his head, found in TRIBOULET something precious beyond gold or territory, an honest voice in a world of sycophants. The fool's wit cut through the endless flattery that surrounded royalty like morning mist, revealing the solid ground beneath. On this particular evening, as the wine flowed and tongues loosened, TRIBOULET's razor wit found its most dangerous target yet. The queen herself, Claude de France, sat in her place of honor, her plain face made beautiful by the kind smile that had endeared her to the French people. She was discussing the latest theological debates with several learned clerics, when TRIBOULET's voice cut through the conversation like a blade through silk. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the suddenly silent hall. "I've been wondering, does the Bible say anything about queens who play the harlot? Because if it does, I fear someone ought to warn our dear sovereign about the company she keeps." The silence that followed was so complete that the very stones seemed to hold their breath. Even the fire appeared to pause in its crackling. Claude's face went white, then red, then white again, while François's expression transformed from amusement to something far more dangerous. The courtiers, sensing the shift in the royal mood, began to edge away from TRIBOULET as if he carried the plague. "TRIBOULET," the king said, his voice soft but carrying the weight of absolute authority. "You have insulted our queen. By the laws of this realm, that offense demands your head. Now, a wise man might have thrown himself upon the royal mercy, might have begged forgiveness and blamed the wine for his loose tongue. But TRIBOULET was not merely wise, he was clever, and there is a world of difference between the two." He bowed deeply, his bells chiming softly in the hushed hall, and when he raised his head, his eyes twinkled with mischief. "Your Majesty is just and merciful beyond measure," he said, his voice carrying that particular tone that suggested hidden depths. "I accept your judgment gladly, but might a humble fool make one small request before he meets his maker?" François I, curious despite his anger, nodded curtly. "Speak quickly." "I ask only this, my lord, that you grant me the privilege of dying before anyone who is more foolish than myself." The king paused, his hand halfway to his sword. Around the hall, the courtiers exchanged glances, some beginning to smile as they caught the subtle trap being laid. "Francois, I was many things proud, impulsive, generous to a fault, but he was not stupid. He saw immediately what TRIBOULET was offering, an escape route that would preserve royal dignity while acknowledging the fool's essential point." "And who," the king asked slowly, "would you consider more foolish than yourself?" TRIBOULET's grin was worth its weight in gold. "Why, anyone who would execute a man for speaking the truth, of course. Anyone who would kill the only person in his court brave enough to warn him when he's being made a fool of by others." The silence stretched like a bowstring, tension crackling between king and fool. Then, slowly, Francois began to laugh. It started as a chuckle, deep in his chest, then grew into the full-throated roar of a man who had just been thoroughly outmaneuvered and couldn't help but admire the artistry of it. The court, reading the royal mood with practiced ease, began to laugh as well, though theirs was tinged with relief. "You clever devil," the king said, wiping tears of laughter from his eyes. "You've caught me neatly, haven't you? Very well. I pardon your offense, but only because you've reminded me of an important truth. Better a fool who speaks honestly than a wise man who lies sweetly." But TRIBOULET's influence on the court went far deeper than this single, dramatic moment. In the weeks and months that followed, his presence seemed to work a subtle magic on the young king's temperament. Francois I, who had come to the throne with the hot blood of youth and the absolute certainty that his royal will was law, began to pause before making the kind of rash decisions that had marked his early reign. When courtiers brought him tales of treachery or incompetence, when they whispered of executions that would send clear messages to potential troublemakers, the king would often glance toward TRIBOULET. The fool might say nothing, might merely raise an eyebrow or tilt his head in that particular way that suggested gentle mockery. But it was enough. The king would remember that rage, however justified, was not the same as justice. The court chroniclers, those careful observers of royal moods and political currents, began to note a change in the king's policies. Where once he might have ordered a rebellious noble's head on a spike, he now imposed fines or exile. Where once he might have executed a corrupt official, he now stripped them of office and sent them to contemplate their sins in religious retreat. These acts of mercy, small in themselves, rippled outward through the kingdom like stones thrown into still water. The great families, who had spent generations locked in deadly feuds, began to see that the young king preferred reconciliation to retribution. Gradually, cautiously, they began to extend olive branches to old enemies. Knowing that Francois I smiled upon those who chose peace over bloodshed. Even the king's later policies bore the subtle influence of his fool's wisdom. When he issued his famous Edict of Tolerance in 1537, allowing for greater religious freedom than had been seen in generations, the court historians noted that it was the first major royal proclamation to be crafted, in the king's own words, with the counsel of all our advisers, even the humblest among them. The irony was not lost on those who knew the court well. TRIBOULET, the twisted fool in his motley rags, had become one of the most influential voices in the kingdom, precisely because he alone possessed the courage to tell the king what he needed to hear, rather than what he wanted to hear. As the years passed and Francois I grew from an impulsive young man into a seasoned ruler, he would often be heard to say that the three most valuable members of his court were his treasurer, his marshal, and his fool. "The first tells me what I can afford," he would joke. "The second tells me what I can conquer, and the third tells me what I cannot escape the truth." And so TRIBOULET, the fool who dared a king, became the fool who helped shape a reign. His legacy lived on in the tolerance edicts, in the peaceful settlements of old feuds, in the royal preference for mercy over vengeance. He had proven that sometimes the most powerful weapon in a kingdom is not a sword or a crown, but a well-timed jest delivered by someone brave enough to speak truth to power. Will Sommers. The evening mist rolled in from the Thames, wrapping Greenwich Palace in a soft grey embrace as the last light of day faded behind the ancient oaks. Through the diamond-paned windows of the royal apartments, candlelight flickered and danced, casting long shadows across tapestried walls where the stories of kings and conquerors played out in golden thread. It was in this gentle twilight hour that a peculiar figure made his way through the palace corridors, his soft footsteps accompanied by the gentle plucking of lute strings and the occasional burst of self-deprecating laughter. Will Sommers was not the sort of man who commanded attention through his appearance. Short and somewhat rotund, with a face that seemed carved from Yorkshire granite and eyes that twinkled with perpetual mischief, he looked more like a prosperous merchant than a member of the royal household. His clothes, while well made, bore the comfortable wrinkles of a man who valued ease over elegance, and his luteous, constant companion showed the worn fingerprints of countless hours spent coaxing melodies from its strings. But appearances, as any fool worth his bells will tell you, can be wonderfully deceiving. Will Sommers was perhaps the most indispensable man in all of England, for he had mastered the most dangerous and delicate art imaginable, keeping Henry VIII human. The king, at this point in his reign, had become something of a force of nature, unpredictable, passionate, and terrifyingly powerful. 6 wives had already learned the hard way that Henry's affections could turn as quickly as English weather, and his court had become a place where men walked on eggshells and spoke in whispers. The great nobles, those proud families who had once stood as equals beside their sovereign, now found themselves reduced to anxious courtiers, forever calculating how to please a monarch whose moods could shift from generous laughter to murderous rage in the space of a heartbeat. Into this atmosphere of perpetual tension came Will Sommers, bearing the ancient privilege of the fool and wielding it with the skill of a master craftsman. Where others saw only the terrible majesty of absolute power, Will saw a man lonely, insecure, and desperately hungry for genuine human connection. He understood, with the intuitive wisdom that marks truly great jesters, that Henry's cruelty often sprang from his isolation, and that sometimes the greatest service a fool could perform was simply to treat a king like a human being. The palace corridors were filled with stories of Will's gentle interventions, each one a small miracle of timing and tact. There was the evening when Henry, in one of his black moods, had ordered the execution of a servant who had spilled wine on the royal doublet. The boy, barely 16, had been dragged away to the Tower, while the king raged about the disrespect shown to his person. Will had said nothing at the time, but later that night he had appeared at the king's private chambers with his lute and a sad little song about a boy who had lost his way in the world. "It's a melancholy tune, Your Majesty," he had said, his fingers picking out the plaintive melody, "about a lad who made a foolish mistake and paid for it with his life. Sad thing is, the song says he might have grown up to be a great man if he'd been given the chance to learn from his error." Henry, who had been brooding over his wine, looked up sharply. "And what does the song say about the man who condemned him?" Will's fingers paused on the strings. "Oh, it says he was a good man, Your Majesty. A man who acted in anger but lived to regret it. The song says he was wise enough to know that mercy is the greatest privilege of power." The next morning, the boy was released from the Tower and sent home to his family with a purse of gold and a royal pardon. The court whispered that it was a miracle, but those who knew Will Sommers recognized it as something far more valuable. The work of a man who understood that kings, like all men, need to be reminded of their better angels. But perhaps Will's finest moment came during the final, terrible days of Anne Boleyn's reign. The Queen, proud and intelligent, had fallen from grace with the stunning swiftness that marked all of Henry's romantic disappointments. She had been arrested, charged with adultery and treason, and was awaiting trial in the Tower. The court, reading the signs with practiced ease, had already begun to shun her memory, speaking of her only in whispers, and preparing for the arrival of Jane Seymour, the king's new obsession. It was then that Will made his most dangerous intervention. He had been present at the final quarrel between Henry and Anne, a vicious scene in which years of accumulated resentment and disappointment had exploded into mutual accusations and bitter recriminations. Anne had accused the king of cruelty and ingratitude, while Henry had raged about her supposed infidelities and her failure to provide him with a male heir. The argument had ended with Anne's arrest, but Will had seen something in the king's eyes that others had missed. Not just anger, but genuine pain. 3 days later, as Henry sat in his private study reviewing the charges against his wife, Will appeared at his side with a cup of wine and a question that seemed to come from nowhere. "Your Majesty," he said, settling into the chair opposite the king with the comfortable familiarity of an old friend. "I've been wondering about something. When a man loves a woman and she disappoints him, does that make her evil, or does it just make her human?" Henry looked up from his papers, his eyes red-rimmed with exhaustion and something that might have been tears. "What are you driving at, Will?" "Oh, nothing profound, Your Majesty. Just thinking about love and disappointment and how they twist a man's judgment. I was married once, you know. Loved my wife dearly, but she had a terrible temper. Used to throw things when she was angry, and she said things that cut me to the bone. But here's the strange thing: when she died, I didn't remember the arguments. I remembered the way she laughed at my jokes, the way she sang while she worked, the way she made me feel like I was the only man in the world." The king was silent for a long moment, his hands still on the papers that would seal Anne's fate. "And what does that have to do with queens and treason?" Will shrugged, his expression carefully neutral. "Nothing at all, Your Majesty. Just thinking out loud about the difference between justice and revenge, about how a man might look back on his choices and wonder if he acted from wisdom or from wounded pride." That night, Henry ordered a stay of execution. Anne Boleyn would still die. Political machinery had advanced too far to be stopped entirely. But Will's gentle intervention had given the king one last night to remember the woman he had loved before. She became the queen he felt compelled to destroy. It was a small mercy, but in the brutal calculus of Tudor politics, small mercies were often the most precious gifts of all. Will's influence extended far beyond these dramatic moments, however. His real genius lay in the countless small interventions that shaped the king's daily decisions. When Henry was ill, which was increasingly often in his later years, Will would sit beside the royal bed and tell stories that gently mocked the pretensions of courtiers, reminding the king that he was surrounded by flatterers and fools. When parliamentary delegations arrived with complaints about royal policies, Will would often be found lurking in the background, ready with a timely joke that would deflate tensions and remind everyone that they were all, at bottom, fallible human beings. Thomas Cromwell, that master of political calculation, understood Will's value better than most. During the Pilgrimage of Grace, when Catholic rebels in the north threatened to march on London, Cromwell had argued for harsh reprisals that would send a clear message to other potential rebels. But Henry, influenced by weeks of Will's gentle stories about mercy and forgiveness, had chosen instead to offer amnesty to those who surrendered peacefully. The policy had worked brilliantly, draining the rebellion of its popular support and ending the crisis without the bloodbath that many had feared. Years later, after Henry's death, Elizabeth I would often speak of her father's fool with something approaching reverence. "He was the only man at court who truly loved my father," she would say, "not for his power or his wealth, but for the man he was underneath the crown. Perhaps that's why my father listened to him when he would hear no one else." The irony was not lost on those who understood the Tudor court. Will Sommers, the simple fool with his lute and his gentle jokes, had become the conscience of the most powerful man in England. Through laughter and song, Through carefully timed stories and perfectly pitched questions, he had helped to humanize a king who might otherwise have been remembered only as a monster. In the end, perhaps that was Will's greatest achievement. He had shown that even absolute power could be tempered by genuine human connection, that even the most fearsome monarch could be reached by someone brave enough to treat him, first and always, as a man. STACZYK. The ancient stones of Krakow's Wawel Castle seemed to whisper secrets in the candlelit darkness, their surfaces worn smooth by centuries of Polish kings and queens who had walked these halls in times of triumph and despair. Tonight, as autumn winds rattled the diamond-paned windows and sent shadows dancing across the tapestried walls, the royal apartments lay wrapped in that peculiar stillness that comes only in the deep hours before dawn, when even the most restless souls find peace in slumber. It was in this hushed sanctuary that a solitary figure sat hunched over a writing desk, his quill scratching softly against parchment as he crafted verses that would, by morning, be on every tongue in the kingdom. STACZYK was not an imposing man to look upon, slight of build, with the pale complexion of one who spent more time in libraries than in courtyards, and dressed in the traditional motley of his profession. But his eyes, sharp as winter stars, held an intelligence that had made him indispensable to the court of Sigismund I and his formidable queen, Bona Sforza. The fool's relationship with power was a delicate dance, one that required not only wit, but an almost supernatural understanding of political currents. Poland in the early 16th century was a nation caught between worlds. To the west lay the Holy Roman Empire, with its endless ambitions and complex alliances, while to the east stretched the vast territories of Muscovy, where Ivan the Terrible was beginning to flex his considerable muscles. In the south, the Ottoman Empire pressed ever northward, its armies carrying the crescent banner toward the heart of Christian Europe. Into this maelstrom of competing interests came STACZYK, armed with nothing more than his wit and his profound understanding of human nature. He had earned his position through a combination of genuine talent and careful cultivation of the royal favor, but he had kept it through something far more valuable: the ability to speak uncomfortable truths in ways that made them palatable to proud and powerful ears. The court of Sigismund I was a place where Italian Renaissance culture mingled with Polish traditions, where humanist scholars debated with Catholic theologians, and where the Queen's fierce intelligence had transformed the royal household into one of the most sophisticated in Europe. Bona Sforza, daughter of the Duke of Milan, had brought with her not only a dowry of gold, but a dowry of ideas, new concepts of governance, diplomacy, and cultural refinement that were slowly transforming Poland from a feudal kingdom into a modern state. But with sophistication came new dangers, and STACZYK understood better than most how easily a court could become so enamored of its own cleverness that it lost sight of practical realities. His role, as he saw it, was to serve as a kind of court conscience, puncturing pretensions and reminding the powerful that intelligence without wisdom was merely educated folly. The most famous example of his political acuity came in the winter of 1514, when disturbing reports began to arrive from the eastern frontier. The Grand Duchy of Moscow was mobilizing its forces, and rumors spoke of a massive army gathering under the command of princes who had sworn to reclaim the fortress city of Smolensk. The Polish court, comfortable in its palaces and confident in its diplomatic skills, was inclined to dismiss these reports as exaggerated. After all, hadn't they always been able to manage their eastern neighbors through a combination of negotiation and strategic marriage alliances? It was then that STACZYK composed his most famous satire, a seemingly innocent tale about a farmer who ignored the signs of an approaching storm because he was too busy admiring his own reflection in a puddle. The poem, written in the flowing Polish that was beginning to emerge as a literary language, was ostensibly about the folly of vanity, but its political implications were unmistakable to anyone who understood the current situation. The farmer in the poem was so enchanted by his own appearance that he failed to notice the dark clouds gathering on the horizon, the sudden stillness in the air, the way the birds had stopped singing and taken shelter. When the storm finally broke, it found him completely unprepared, his crops destroyed and his livestock scattered. The poem's final lines, which became a proverb that echoed through Polish literature for generations, spoke of how the wise man watches the sky while the fool admires his shadow. The satire spread through the court like wildfire, copied by scribes and recited by courtiers who understood its deeper meaning. Within days, King Sigismund had ordered a complete review of the kingdom's eastern defences, and by spring, new fortifications were under construction along the frontier. When the Muscovite attack finally came, Poland was ready, and Smolensk remained in Polish hands. But Stańczyk's influence extended far beyond military matters. His greatest triumph came during what court historians would later call the Night of the Royal Lion, an episode that perfectly illustrated his ability to shape policy through the power of storytelling. The occasion was a diplomatic crisis involving the Teutonic Knights, those formidable warrior monks who had once terrorized the Baltic coast, but were now reduced to a shadow of their former power. The knights had sent an embassy to Krakow with a proposal that seemed, on the surface, quite reasonable. They would cede certain disputed territories to Poland in exchange for military support against their enemies in Prussia. The proposal had the backing of several powerful nobles who saw an opportunity to expand Polish influence in the north, and even Queen Bona was inclined to support it as a means of strengthening the kingdom's position in the Baltic. But Stańczyk sensed a trap. The Teutonic Knights, for all their reduced circumstances, were still masters of political intrigue, and he suspected that their apparent generosity concealed a more sinister purpose. The problem was that his suspicions were based on intuition rather than evidence, and in a court that prided itself on rational analysis, intuition was a weak foundation for policy arguments. So instead of presenting his concerns directly, Stańczyk chose to tell a story. On the night before the final council meeting was to take place, he appeared in the royal apartments with a tale that seemed to have nothing to do with current events. It was, he said, an ancient fable about a lion who had grown old and lost his strength, and the pack of wolves who came to him with an offer of alliance. The wolves, in Stańczyk's telling, were very persuasive. They pointed out that the lion was no longer strong enough to hunt effectively, while they had the speed and cunning to bring down even the largest prey. If the lion would simply lend them the authority of his roar, they would share their kills with him and ensure that he lived out his days in comfort and dignity. The lion, flattered by their apparent respect and seduced by the promise of easy meals, agreed to the arrangement. But as the months passed, he began to notice that the wolves were bringing him smaller and smaller portions of their kills. When he complained, they reminded him that he was, after all, growing old, and surely didn't need as much food as he once had. When he roared in anger, they pointed out that his roar had lost its power and that the other animals no longer feared him. Eventually, the lion realized that the wolves had never intended to honor their bargain. They had simply wanted to neutralize the threat he represented while they consolidated their own power. By the time he understood their true intentions, it was too late. He had become dependent on their charity and had lost the strength to challenge them. The story's parallel to the Teutonic proposal was unmistakable, and by morning, the entire court was discussing the fable's implications. When the council finally met, the mood had shifted dramatically. Instead of seeing the knight's offer as an opportunity, the nobles now viewed it with suspicion, and after careful deliberation, they decided to reject the proposal in favor of a more cautious approach to Baltic politics. Later investigation would prove Stańczyk's instincts correct. The Teutonic Knights had indeed been planning to use Polish military support to eliminate their enemies before turning on their erstwhile allies. The rejected alliance, far from being a missed opportunity, would have been a disaster for Poland. Word of the fool's wisdom spread beyond the borders of Poland, and STACZYK became something of a legend throughout Eastern Europe. Other courts began to seek his counsel on matters of diplomacy and statecraft, and his reputation as a political sage grew to match his fame as a wit. The irony was not lost on those who knew him well. The man who dressed as a fool and spoke in riddles had become one of the most influential voices in European politics. But perhaps STACZYK's greatest achievement was not any single intervention, but the way he helped to shape the intellectual climate of his age. His emphasis on practical wisdom over theoretical knowledge, his insistence that intelligence without common sense was merely educated folly, became hallmarks of Polish political thought. The nobles who had grown up listening to his stories carried his lessons with them into their own positions of power, and his influence could be seen in the pragmatic, skeptical approach that characterized Polish diplomacy for generations. In later centuries, when Poland faced the greatest crises of its existence, patriots would invoke STACZYK's memory as a symbol of the nation's conscience. The image of the fool who spoke truth to power became a powerful metaphor for resistance to tyranny, and his name became synonymous with the courage to challenge authority when authority had lost its way. The Revolution of 1830, the January Uprising of 1863, the resistance to Nazi occupation during World War II, all of these movements claimed STACZYK as their spiritual ancestor, the jester who had shown that even the humblest citizen could influence the course of history through the power of truth-telling and moral courage. And so the slight figure in motley, hunched over his writing desk in the candlelit chambers of Wawel Castle, became something far greater than a mere entertainer. He became the embodiment of an idea that wisdom could triumph over power, that truth could overcome deception, and that sometimes the most profound insights came from those who wore the mask of folly. Archibald Armstrong. The corridors of Whitehall Palace stretched endlessly through the November gloom, their stone floors worn smooth by centuries of royal feet and ambitious courtiers. In the distance, the muffled sound of conversation drifted from the council chambers, where matters of state were being debated with the gravity that befitted the court of two kings. But here, in this quieter wing of the palace, a different kind of conversation was taking place, marked by the distinctive lilting burr of the Scottish borders and punctuated by the occasional burst of laughter that seemed to echo off the ancient stones like music. Archibald Armstrong, known throughout the court simply as Archie, was not a man who commanded attention through his physical presence. Short and wiry, with the weathered face of someone who had spent his youth in the harsh hill country between Scotland and England, he moved through the palace with the careful grace of a shepherd who had learned to read the moods of both weather and wolves. His clothes, while well made, bore the comfortable wrinkles of a man who valued practicality over fashion, and his speech, with its distinctive border accent, marked him as an outsider in a court where Southern English was the language of advancement. But Archie Armstrong was far more than just another provincial who had somehow found his way into royal service. He was a man who had risen from the humblest beginnings to become one of the most influential figures in the kingdom, and his journey from shepherd to royal fool was itself a testament to the transformative power of wit and wisdom. Born in the wild country near the Scottish border, Archie had spent his early years in a landscape where survival depended on quick thinking and quicker reflexes. The border reivers, those notorious cattle thieves and raiders who had terrorized the region for generations, had taught him valuable lessons about human nature: how to read the signs of approaching danger, how to diffuse tense situations with humor, and how to speak truth in ways that wouldn't provoke violence. These skills had served him well when he first came to the attention of James VI of Scotland, who would later become James I of England. The young king, struggling to unite his fractious kingdom and establish his authority over nobles who had grown used to treating royalty as merely first among equals, had found in Archie something precious and rare. A voice that could speak honestly without threatening, that could criticize without condemning, and that could offer guidance without seeming to presume. The transition from the relatively informal Scottish court to the elaborate ceremonial of English royalty might have overwhelmed a lesser man, but Archie had adapted with the same pragmatic intelligence that had served him on the borders. He understood instinctively that the English court, for all its pomp and circumstance, was fundamentally similar to the tribal societies he had known in his youth, a place where power was personal, where loyalty was earned rather than commanded, and where the ability to read human character was more valuable than any formal education. James I, that scholarly king who fancied himself a theologian and political theorist, had found in Archie a perfect complement to his own intellectual nature. Where the king was given to long theoretical discussions about the divine right of rulers and the proper relationship between church and state, Archie offered practical wisdom grounded in real-world experience. Where James was inclined to see political problems as abstract puzzles to be solved through careful reasoning, Archie understood that politics was ultimately about people, with all their irrationalities and contradictions. The fool's influence on royal policy was subtle but profound. During the complex negotiations that led to the Treaty of London in 1604, ending the long war between England and Spain, Archie had played a crucial role in maintaining the king's commitment to peace. When hawks at court argued for continued military action, when they spoke of national honor and the need to show strength to foreign powers, Archie would quietly remind the king of the real cost of war, not just in gold and territory, but in the lives of ordinary people who had no voice in the councils of power. His most famous intervention came during the heated debates over religious policy that marked James's early reign. The king, caught between the demands of Puritan reformers who wanted to purge the Church of England of all Catholic influences, and more traditional churchmen who feared that too much change would lead to chaos, had found himself paralyzed by the complexity of the theological issues involved. It was then that Archie, with his border shepherd's understanding of human nature, had offered a different perspective. "Your Majesty," he had said during one particularly heated council session, "I've been thinking about this business of religious reform, and it puts me in mind of something I learned tending sheep in the hills." The king, always interested in practical wisdom, had encouraged him to continue. "You see, Your Majesty, when you're trying to move a flock from one pasture to another, you don't drive them all at once. The sheep get nervous, they start to mill about, and before you know it, they've scattered in all directions. But if you move them gradually, letting them get used to each change before you make the next one, they'll follow you anywhere." The metaphor had resonated with James, who had been struggling to find a middle path between competing religious factions. Instead of attempting sweeping reforms that might provoke a backlash, he had chosen to implement changes gradually, allowing both reformers and traditionalists to adjust to new realities before pressing for further modifications. The policy had worked brilliantly, preventing the religious wars that had torn apart other European kingdoms, and establishing a precedent for pragmatic compromise that would serve England well in the centuries to come. But Archie's influence extended beyond matters of state policy. His greatest achievement may have been his role in preparing the way for the eventual accession of Charles I, James's son and heir. The young prince, unlike his scholarly father, was a man of action rather than contemplation, more interested in art and ceremony than in theological debate. This difference in temperament had created tensions within the royal family, with James sometimes expressing doubts about his son's readiness to inherit the throne. Archie had served as an unofficial mediator in these family disputes, using his unique position as someone trusted by both father and son to help them understand each other's perspectives. He had helped James see that Charles's interest in ceremony and visual display was not mere vanity but a legitimate tool of statecraft, a way of inspiring loyalty and commanding respect that complemented the king's own more intellectual approach to leadership. At the same time, he had helped Charles understand the importance of his father's scholarly interests, showing him how theological and political theory could provide a solid foundation for practical governance. Through countless private conversations and carefully crafted public performances, Archie had helped to smooth the transition from one reign to the next, ensuring that the fundamental policies of the kingdom would continue, even as the style of leadership evolved. When Charles finally inherited the throne in 1625, he had retained Archie's services, recognizing the value of having someone who could speak honestly about the challenges facing the kingdom. But the new king's court was a different world from that of his father, more formal, more hierarchical, and less tolerant of the kind of free-speaking that had characterized James's reign. It was this changing atmosphere that led to Archie's most famous and final intervention in royal policy. The issue was the growing influence of William Laud, the Archbishop of Canterbury, whose efforts to impose religious uniformity throughout the kingdom had begun to provoke serious resistance, particularly in Scotland and among English Puritans. Archie, with his border upbringing and his understanding of Scottish temperament, had recognized the dangers of Laud's policies long before they became apparent to the court. He had tried, through his traditional methods of storytelling and gentle mockery, to warn the king about the risks of pushing religious reform too far and too fast. His efforts had culminated in a public performance that became legendary among those who witnessed it. During a court ceremony in which Archbishop Laud was present, Archie had offered a seemingly innocent toast to the health of all those who serve God faithfully, whether they kneel or stand, whether they cross themselves or clasp their hands, whether they wear silk or sackcloth. The toast had been accompanied by a pointed look at the Archbishop, whose elaborate vestments and ceremonial practices had become symbols of the religious divide that was beginning to tear the kingdom apart. Laud, understanding the criticism implicit in the toast, had complained to the king about the fool's insolence. Charles, caught between his affection for his father's old servant and his loyalty to his chosen archbishop, had found himself in an impossible position. The result had been Archie's dismissal from court, an event that marked the end of an era and the beginning of the troubles that would eventually lead to civil war. But even in defeat, Archie had achieved a final victory. His dismissal had been seen by many as a symbol of the changing character of the monarchy, a sign that the new king was less willing than his father to tolerate dissent or listen to uncomfortable truths. This perception had contributed to the growing sense of alienation between the court and the country, and had helped to fuel the opposition movements that would eventually challenge royal authority. The stories of Archie's wit and wisdom had spread throughout the kingdom, carried by former courtiers and visitors to the palace who had witnessed his performances. His sayings had become part of the common stock of political wisdom, and his example had inspired others to speak truth to power, even at the cost of their own advancement. Years later, when parliamentary leaders sought to justify their resistance to royal authority, they would invoke the memory of Archie Armstrong as evidence that even the most loyal servants of the crown could be driven to opposition by the folly of their rulers. The fool who had once counseled kings had become, in death, a symbol of the conscience that all governments must heed if they are to retain the loyalty of their subjects. And so the shepherd from the Scottish borders, who had risen to become the confidant of kings, had achieved a final transformation from court jester to national symbol, from entertainer to embodiment of the principle that, in a just society, even the humblest citizen must be free to speak truth to power. Mathurine de Saint-Jean. The torches lining the grand courtyard of the Louvre flickered against the midnight darkness, their flames dancing in the gentle breeze that swept through the heart of Paris. Above, the ancient stones of the palace seemed to glow with their own inner light, as if the very walls had absorbed centuries of royal grandeur and were now releasing it back into the night. It was an hour when most of the court had retired to their chambers, when the great halls echoed with nothing more than the whispered conversations of night guards and the soft footfalls of servants attending to their final duties. But tonight, the usual quiet was broken by the sound of hoofbeats on cobblestones, a rhythmic clatter that seemed to dance in time with the flickering torchlight. Through the palace gates rode a figure that would have seemed impossible in any other court in Europe, a woman dressed in the plumed armor of a cavalry officer, her horse prancing beneath her with the easy grace of a creature born to pageantry. The guards, long accustomed to the eccentricities of their royal masters, barely glanced up as she passed, though more than one smiled at the sight of the familiar figure who had become as much a part of the Louvre's character as its ancient towers. Mathurine de Saint-Jean was a woman who defied every convention of her age, yet somehow managed to do so with such style and grace that even the most conservative courtiers found themselves charmed rather than scandalized. In an era when women were expected to be silent ornaments to male power, she had carved out a role as one of the most influential voices in the French court. In a time when jesters were traditionally male, she had proven that wit and wisdom knew no gender, and in an age when the very idea of a woman in armor was considered either blasphemous or absurd, she had made herself indispensable as both entertainer and protector to two of France's most remarkable kings. Her rise to prominence had been as unlikely as her current position. Born into a family of minor nobility in Normandy, Mathurine had displayed from an early age the kind of quick wit and fearless spirit that marked her as different from her contemporaries. While other girls her age were learning embroidery and deportment, she had been reading the classical authors, studying the art of rhetoric, and practicing the skills of horsemanship that would later serve her so well at court. Her entry into royal service had come during the turbulent reign of Henri III, that most complex and contradictory of monarchs who had struggled to maintain his authority amid the religious wars that were tearing France apart. The king, himself a patron of the arts and a lover of theatrical display, had been immediately taken with Mathurine's combination of intelligence, humor, and sheer audacity. He had granted her the unprecedented privilege of appearing at court in male attire, a decision that had scandalized the nobility but had proven to be a stroke of genius. For Mathurine had brought to the court something it desperately needed in those dark days: the ability to find laughter in the midst of tragedy, to offer hope when despair seemed the only rational response to the chaos surrounding them. Her performances, whether on horseback in the palace courtyard or in the more intimate setting of the royal apartments, had provided a kind of relief that traditional court entertainments could never match. But her true genius lay not in her ability to entertain, but in her skill at navigating the treacherous waters of religious politics that dominated her era. France in the late 16th century was a nation divided against itself, with Catholic and Protestant factions locked in a struggle that threatened to destroy the kingdom entirely. The court itself was a microcosm of these larger conflicts, with nobles choosing sides based on a complex mixture of genuine religious conviction, family loyalty, and political calculation. Into this poisonous atmosphere, Mathurine had brought a different perspective. Neither Catholic nor Protestant in her fundamental loyalties, she had served as a kind of neutral ground where members of opposing factions could meet and discover their common humanity. Her jokes, carefully crafted to find humor in the absurdities of both sides, had helped to diffuse tensions that might otherwise have exploded into violence. Her most famous intervention in court politics had come during the transition from Henri III to Henri IV, that remarkable moment when France had chosen pragmatism over religious purity and had accepted a Protestant king who promised to convert to Catholicism for the good of the realm. The transition had been fraught with danger, as Catholic extremists plotted to prevent Henri's coronation, while Protestant hardliners questioned whether their champion could be trusted once he had changed his faith. Mathurine had played a crucial role in smoothing this transition, using her unique position to carry messages between the two camps and to help moderate voices on both sides find common ground. Her performances during this period had been masterpieces of political theatre, carefully balanced presentations that acknowledged the legitimate concerns of both Catholics and Protestants, while pointing toward the possibility of coexistence. But her greatest moment had come in 1594, when her quick thinking and physical courage had literally saved the life of Henri IV and changed the course of French history. The occasion was a reception at the Louvre for a delegation of foreign ambassadors, a glittering affair designed to showcase the stability and prosperity of the newly unified kingdom. Henry IV, confident in his popularity and secure in his authority, had moved freely among his guests, accepting their congratulations and discussing matters of mutual interest, with the easy charm that had made him beloved throughout France. It was during this reception that a young man named Jean Châtel had approached the king, ostensibly to present a petition, but actually carrying a concealed dagger with which he intended to strike down the Protestant-turned-Catholic monarch, whose very existence he saw as an affront to God. Châtel had been well trained by his Jesuit mentors in the art of dissimulation, and his approach had aroused no suspicion among the king's guards or courtiers. But Mathurin, ever watchful and blessed with the performer's instinct for reading human behavior, had noticed something in the young man's demeanor that had set off alarm bells in her mind. Perhaps it was the way his eyes never quite met those of the people he passed, or the slight tremor in his hands that spoke of barely controlled nervous energy, or simply some indefinable quality that marked him as someone whose intentions did not match his actions. Whatever the source of her suspicion, Mathurin had acted with the split-second decisiveness that separated the truly brave from the merely well-intentioned. As Châtel raised his dagger for the killing blow, she had spurred her horse forward, the animal's bulk knocking the would-be assassin to the ground and sending his weapon skittering across the marble floor. The plot had been foiled, the king's life saved, and France spared the chaos that would certainly have followed Henri's assassination. The aftermath of this incident had elevated Mathurin from court entertainer to national hero. Henry IV, genuinely grateful for her intervention and keenly aware of the propaganda value of the story, had made her courage a centerpiece of his royal mythology. Court artists had created paintings depicting the scene, with Mathurin portrayed as a kind of warrior angel sent by God to protect his chosen king. Poets had composed verses celebrating her bravery, and her story had been spread throughout the kingdom as proof that Henry enjoyed divine protection. But beyond its immediate political impact, the incident had also helped to transform contemporary ideas about the proper role of women in society. Mathurin's heroism had made it impossible to dismiss female courage as a contradiction in terms, and her example had inspired other women to seek more active roles in the life of the nation. The salons that would later become such an important feature of French intellectual life could trace their origins, in part, to the precedent she had set for women as active participants in political discourse. Her influence on Henri IV himself had been equally profound. The king, already inclined toward religious tolerance as a matter of practical politics, had found in Mathurin a living example of how people of different backgrounds and beliefs could work together for the common good. Her presence at court had served as a constant reminder that loyalty to the crown could transcend the religious divisions that had torn France apart for so long. In the years that followed, Henri's policies of religious tolerance and national reconciliation had owed much to the example set by his unlikely protector. The Edict of Nantes, which granted significant rights to Protestant minorities while maintaining the Catholic character of the French state, had reflected the kind of pragmatic compromise that Mathurin had embodied throughout her career. Her later years had been marked by continued service to the crown and growing recognition of her unique contribution to French political life. She had become something of an elder stateswoman, consulted by court officials on matters ranging from ceremonial protocol to questions of public morale. Her opinions carried weight not because of any formal position she held, but because of the respect she had earned through decades of faithful service and demonstrated wisdom. When she finally died, well into the reign of Louis XIII, her funeral had been attended by representatives of every major noble family in France, Protestant and Catholic alike. The king himself had served as one of the pallbearers, an unprecedented honor that spoke to the extraordinary esteem in which she was held. But perhaps her greatest legacy lay not in any single dramatic incident, but in the way she had quietly transformed the possibilities available to her contemporaries. Through her example, she had shown that courage and wisdom were not the exclusive province of any single gender, that women could serve their country as effectively as men, and that the traditional boundaries that confined people to narrow social roles were far more flexible than anyone had previously imagined. The image of Mathurin on horseback, her plumed armor gleaming in the torchlight as she rode through the courtyard of the Louvre, had become a symbol of the new kind of France that Henry IV was trying to create, a nation where merit mattered more than birth, where loyalty counted for more than religious orthodoxy, and where even the most unlikely people could rise to positions of influence and respect. And so, the woman who had begun her career as an entertainer had ended it as something far more significant. A pioneer who had helped to expand the very definition of what it meant to be French, to be brave, and to serve one's country with honor and distinction. Chicot. The taverns of late Valois Paris glowed like amber jewels against the darkness of a city perpetually on edge, their windows casting warm pools of light onto cobblestones that had witnessed too much blood in recent years. Inside these sanctuaries of temporary peace, merchants and artisans, soldiers and students gathered to escape the tensions that gripped the capital like a fever. The air was thick with the smoke of tallow candles and the aroma of wine and roasted meat, while conversations buzzed with the kind of nervous energy that marked a population living through uncertain times. In one such tavern, in a corner where the light fell just so, a remarkable figure held court with an audience that would have been impossible in any other circumstances. Nobles sat beside commoners, Catholics next to Huguenots, all drawn together by the magnetic presence of a man whose rapier wit was matched only by the very real rapier that hung at his side. Chicot was his name, though whether this was the name given to him at birth or merely the latest in a series of identities he had assumed over the years was a matter of some debate. What was not debatable was his extraordinary ability to navigate the treacherous waters of French politics during the wars of religion, that bloody period when neighbor turned against neighbor, and the very survival of the kingdom hung in the balance. Chicot was that rarest of creatures, a jester who was also a soldier, a comedian who was also a spy, a man who could make people laugh even as he prepared to kill them or die for his beliefs. His appearance was as distinctive as his personality, tall and lean, with the kind of wiry strength that spoke of years spent handling weapons and riding hard roads. He moved with the fluid grace of a trained fighter. His clothes, while obviously expensive, bore the practical modifications of a man who expected to need freedom of movement at a moment's notice, sleeves that wouldn't bind, boots designed for running or riding, and always, the gleaming rapier that had earned him a reputation throughout Paris as one of the finest swordsmen of his generation. But it was his face that people remembered most clearly. Chicot possessed what contemporary observers called the eyes of a man who has seen everything and been surprised by nothing. Eyes that could sparkle with mirth one moment and turn deadly serious the next. His mouth seemed perpetually poised between a smile and a sneer, as if he found the entire world amusing, but was never quite sure whether the joke was worth laughing at. His rise to prominence had come during the reign of Henri III, that tortured monarch who had inherited a kingdom in chaos and had spent his entire reign trying to hold it together through a combination of political maneuvering, religious compromise, and sheer force of will. The king, himself, a complex figure who combined genuine piety with a love of luxury and ceremony, had found in Chicot something he desperately needed, a man who could serve him in multiple capacities and whose loyalty was absolute precisely because it was freely given rather than purchased. For Chicot was not merely a court entertainer, but a trusted agent who carried out the most delicate and dangerous missions on behalf of the crown. His ability to assume different identities, to blend into any social setting, and to extract information through a combination of charm and intimidation had made him invaluable during a period when the king's survival often depended on knowing what his enemies were planning before they could act. One of his most famous exploits had occurred during the siege of Paris in 1590, when the city was held by the Catholic League against the forces of Henri IV. The situation had been desperate, with the population beginning to starve and morale collapsing as it became clear that relief was not coming. It was then that Chicot had undertaken one of the most audacious missions in the annals of French espionage. Disguised as a traveling minstrel, he had made his way through the enemy lines and into the very heart of the besiegers' camp. There, performing for the entertainment of officers who had no idea they were harboring one of their most dangerous enemies, he had gathered intelligence about their plans and troop dispositions. But his greatest achievement had been the warning he had managed to convey to the defenders of the city. The message had been delivered in the form of a seemingly innocent song about a shepherd who had spotted wolves approaching his flock. The lyrics, crafted with the kind of wordplay that had made Chicot famous throughout the kingdom, had contained detailed information about the timing and direction of the planned assault. The warning had allowed the defenders to prepare their countermeasures, and when the attack finally came, it had been repelled with devastating losses to the besiegers. But Chicot's influence extended far beyond his activities as a spy and agent. His real genius lay in his understanding of how public opinion could be shaped and directed, and his ability to use humor as a weapon in the propaganda war that accompanied the actual fighting. During an era when most people could not read, when news traveled slowly and often arrived distorted by the biases of its carriers, a clever joke or a well-crafted song could influence popular sentiment more effectively than any written proclamation. His performances in the taverns and public squares of Paris had become legendary, carefully choreographed presentations that appeared spontaneous but were actually designed to advance specific political objectives. He had perfected the art of the double entendre, the joke that could be interpreted one way by supporters and another way by enemies, allowing him to spread royal propaganda while maintaining plausible deniability if challenged. Perhaps his most brilliant innovation had been the mock knighting ceremony he had performed for himself in the courtyard of the Louvre, a piece of political theatre that had become one of the most talked-about events of Henri III's reign. The ceremony had been ostensibly a piece of harmless foolery, with Chicot using a wooden sword to dub himself Knight of the Order of Mirth, while reciting a mock heroic speech about his conquests in the realm of laughter. But the ceremony had also served a more serious purpose, subtly reinforcing the king's authority at a time when the very concept of royal legitimacy was under attack. By treating the rituals of knighthood as subjects for gentle mockery, Chicot had actually strengthened their symbolic power, reminding the audience that these ceremonies derived their meaning from the respect accorded to them, rather than from any inherent magical properties. The performance had been a masterpiece of royal image crafting, presenting Henri III as a monarch secure enough in his authority to allow himself to be gently mocked, wise enough to value wit and creativity, and confident enough in his legitimacy to permit traditional ceremonies to be subjected to humorous treatment. The message, carefully embedded in layers of entertainment, had been that this was a king who ruled through consent rather than fear, a modern monarch for a sophisticated age. But Chicot's career had also illustrated the terrible costs of living through the wars of religion, the way that constant violence and uncertainty could corrupt even the most noble spirits. As the years had passed, and the conflicts had grown more bitter, he had found himself drawn deeper into activities that bore little resemblance to the light-hearted entertainment that had first brought him to royal attention. The man who had once delighted audiences with his wordplay and theatrical stunts had gradually become something darker and more dangerous, a figure who moved through the shadows of Paris carrying out missions that he never discussed and serving causes that he never fully explained. The rapier at his side, once merely a symbol of his gentleman's status, had become a working tool stained with the blood of men who had crossed his path or threatened his king. His friends and Chicot had many friends, drawn from every level of society, watched with concern as the laughter gradually faded from his eyes, replaced by the hard wisdom of a man who had seen too much and done too much to ever again find the world truly amusing. The jester who had once embodied the possibility that even in the darkest times, human beings could find reasons to smile, had gradually transformed into something resembling the very forces of violence and hatred that he had originally opposed. Yet even in his darker moments, Chicot had retained something of his original spirit. His loyalty to Henry III had never wavered, even when that loyalty required him to act in ways that contradicted his own moral instincts. And when the king had finally fallen to an assassin's knife in 1589, Chicot had mourned him with a grief that went beyond mere professional disappointment to encompass genuine personal loss. The death of Henri III had marked the end of an era, and with it, the end of Chicot's career as a major figure in French politics. Henry IV, the Huguenot king who had inherited the throne, had his own favorites and his own methods of managing public opinion. While he had treated Chicot with respect and had even employed him on occasion, the special relationship that had existed between the jester and his royal master could not be replicated. In his final years, Chicot had retreated from the public stage, spending his time in quiet reflection on the extraordinary life he had led and the price he had paid for his unique position at the intersection of entertainment and espionage. Those who knew him during this period spoke of a man who had achieved a kind of peace with himself, who had found in the simple pleasures of friendship and conversation a satisfaction that had eluded him during his years at the center of power. When he died, sometime in the early years of the 17th century, his funeral had been attended by representatives of every faction that had torn France apart during the previous decades. Catholics and Huguenots, royalists and republicans, nobles and commoners had all come to pay their respects to a man who had somehow managed to serve his conscience while serving his king, who had found ways to remain human in the midst of inhuman times. The image that lingered in the memories of those who had known him was not of the spy or the propagandist or the swordsman, but of the entertainer, the man whose rapier had flashed between jokes in the amber glow of a Parisian tavern, whose laughter had provided brief moments of joy in an age that had known far too little happiness. Roland le Farter. The great hall of Norwich Castle glowed with the warm light of 100 candles, their flames dancing merrily against the ancient stone walls as the Yuletide feast reached its crescendo. Outside, the December wind howled across the Norfolk countryside, but within these walls all was warmth and celebration. The tables groaned under the weight of roasted swans and peacocks, their feathers carefully replaced to create the illusion of living birds resting among the platters of delicacies. Silver goblets caught the candlelight as they were raised in toast after toast, and the air was rich with the scents of cinnamon, cloves, and the kind of mulled wine that made even the most dignified nobleman forget his usual reserve. It was Christmas Day in the year of our Lord 1204, and Henry II's court was celebrating with the kind of magnificent excess that marked the Plantagenet dynasty at its height. The king himself, though now in his 50s and bearing the weight of ruling an empire that stretched from Scotland to the Pyrenees, seemed rejuvenated by the festive atmosphere. His famous Angevin temper, which had already brought him into conflict with Thomas Becket and would continue to plague his relationships with his rebellious sons, was nowhere in evidence tonight. Instead, he laughed with genuine pleasure at the entertainments provided for his amusement, his eyes bright with the kind of royal contentment that came only rarely to medieval monarchs. The evening's festivities had already featured the usual array of court entertainments. Troubadours had sung of courtly love and chivalric adventure. Acrobats had performed feats that drew gasps of amazement from the assembled nobility, and the court musicians had played melodies that set feet tapping beneath the tables. But as the evening wore on and the wine began to take effect, the entertainment had gradually shifted toward the more robust and earthy humor that marked medieval popular culture. It was at this moment, when the court was perfectly prepared for something extraordinary, that a figure emerged from among the minstrels who had been providing background music throughout the feast. Roland Lafata was not an imposing man to look upon, of medium height and build, with the kind of unremarkable features that allowed him to blend into any crowd. His clothes, while clean and well-maintained, marked him clearly as a member of the merchant class rather than the nobility. But there was something in his bearing, a confidence and showmanship that suggested he was no ordinary entertainer. What happened next would become the stuff of legend, a performance so remarkable that it would be recorded in official documents, celebrated in ballads, and remembered in family stories for generations to come. Roland had positioned himself in the center of the hall, where every eye could see him clearly, and had waited for the conversations to die down and attention to focus on him. Then, with the timing of a master performer, he had begun what contemporary chroniclers would describe as his legendary jump whistle fart. The performance itself was a masterpiece of physical comedy and technical skill. Roland would leap into the air with remarkable agility, and at the precise moment of his highest elevation, he would emit a clear, musical whistle while simultaneously producing what medieval sources delicately referred to as a resounding blast from his nether regions. The combination of athleticism, musical ability, and what could only be called biological precision created a spectacle that was both absurd and oddly impressive. But what elevated Roland's performance from mere crude humor to something approaching art was the way he had structured the entire presentation. Each jump whistle fart was slightly different from the last, creating a kind of musical progression that built toward a climactic finale. The whistles varied in pitch and duration, the jumps incorporated different acrobatic elements, and even the gaseous emissions seemed to follow some kind of rhythmic pattern that complemented the overall performance. The effect on the royal audience was electric. Henry II, who had witnessed every form of entertainment imaginable during his long reign, found himself laughing with a kind of childlike delight that his courtiers had rarely seen. The Queen and the noble ladies, after an initial moment of shocked silence, began to giggle behind their hands, their laughter growing more open as they realized that even royal dignity could not withstand the sheer absurdity of what they were witnessing. But it was not just the humor of the performance that impressed the court. Medieval society, for all its elaborate hierarchies and formal protocols, retained a healthy appreciation for the kinds of bodily functions that later ages would consider unsuitable for polite company. Roland's ability to turn such natural processes into entertainment spoke to a worldview that saw the human body as part of God's creation, worthy of celebration rather than shame. The king's delight with the performance had immediate and lasting consequences. In an age when royal favor could transform a commoner's life overnight, Henry II's obvious pleasure with Roland's entertainment opened doors that no amount of conventional talent could have unlocked. Within days of the performance, the court was buzzing with rumors about the unusual reward the king was planning for his newest favorite entertainer. The reward, when it came, exceeded even the most extravagant expectations. Henry II, in a gesture that perfectly captured both his sense of humor and his understanding of the symbolic power of royal generosity, had granted Roland Lafata the manor of Hemmingstone in Suffolk, complete with all its lands, tenants, and revenues. The grant came with only one condition: Roland must appear at court each Christmas to perform his unique entertainment for the royal pleasure. This extraordinary grant was more than just a humorous gesture on the king's part. It represented a sophisticated understanding of the relationship between royal power and popular culture, between the formal structures of feudal society and the informal networks of loyalty and affection that actually held the kingdom together. By rewarding Roland so lavishly, Henry was making a statement about the kind of king he chose to be, not a distant, unapproachable figure, obsessed with his own dignity, but a ruler who could appreciate talent in all its forms, and who understood that laughter was one of the most powerful tools of kingship. The grant of Hemmingstone also illustrated the complex dynamics of land tenure that characterized medieval society. In an age when most property was held in exchange for military service, Roland's obligation to perform annually for the king represented a charming variation on the usual feudal obligations. His tenancy was based not on his ability to provide knights for royal armies or to defend strategic positions, but on his capacity to bring joy to the royal court. This arrangement served several important political functions. It demonstrated the king's power to create new forms of feudal obligation, his ability to reward loyalty and talent in unexpected ways, and his confidence in his own position. A king who could afford to grant valuable land in exchange for entertainment was clearly a king who felt secure in his authority and generous in his disposition. The story of Roland's reward also provided Henry with valuable propaganda benefits. In an age when most people never saw their king and knew him only through the stories told by traveling entertainers, Roland's tale became a powerful symbol of royal accessibility and generosity. The image of a king who would grant a manor in exchange for a good laugh was exactly the kind of story that enhanced royal popularity among the common people. But the arrangement also served more practical purposes. Roland's annual performances became important social events that brought together members of the court who might otherwise have little reason to interact. The shared experience of laughter created bonds of fellowship that transcended the usual factional divisions that plagued medieval courts. In a very real sense, Roland's Christmas performances became a form of royal diplomacy, a way of building consensus and loyalty through the simple expedient of bringing people together to enjoy themselves. The success of this arrangement was evident in its longevity. Roland faithfully performed his Christmas entertainment for Henry II throughout the remainder of the king's reign, and the tradition continued under Richard the Lionheart and John Lackland. Each performance became a kind of royal ceremony, eagerly anticipated by courtiers and carefully orchestrated to maximize both entertainment value and political impact. The annual performances also served as a kind of informal gauge of the kingdom's political health. When Roland's entertainment was greeted with genuine laughter and enthusiasm, it suggested that the court was confident and unified. When the laughter seemed forced or the atmosphere tense, it often indicated underlying political problems that might soon manifest themselves in more serious ways. Roland himself had proven remarkably adept at adapting his performances to reflect the changing moods and circumstances of the court. During times of political crisis, his entertainment took on a more subdued character, providing gentle relief from tension rather than boisterous celebration. During periods of triumph and prosperity, his performances became more elaborate and confident, reflecting the general mood of optimism that pervaded the court. The manor of Hemmingstone prospered under Roland's stewardship, becoming a model of efficient agricultural management and progressive land use. Roland had proven to be not only a talented entertainer, but also a capable administrator, managing his estate with the same attention to detail and timing that characterized his performances. The prosperity of his lands served as another form of royal propaganda, demonstrating that the king's generosity produced lasting benefits rather than mere temporary pleasure. When Roland finally died, sometime during the early years of John's reign, his funeral was attended by representatives of every major noble family in England. The king himself served as one of the pallbearers, an honor that would have been unthinkable for a mere entertainer under any other circumstances. But Roland had transcended the usual categories of medieval society, becoming something unique in the annals of English history. His legacy lived on in the legal documents that recorded his unusual feudal obligation, in the ballads that celebrated his extraordinary performances, and in the administrative records that tracked the prosperity of his estate. But perhaps, more importantly, his story became part of the folklore of kingship itself, a reminder that effective rulers must be able to appreciate the full range of human talents, and that sometimes the most profound political statements are made through the simple act of sharing laughter. The image that remained fixed in the memories of those who had witnessed his performances was of a man suspended in mid-air, his whistle clear and true, his expression focused with professional concentration, creating a moment of pure, absurd joy in the midst of a world that offered few enough opportunities for genuine happiness. In that frozen instant, Roland Lafata had achieved something remarkable. He had transformed the most basic of human functions into a source of wonder and delight, proving that art could be found in the most unexpected places and that dignity and humor were not necessarily incompatible. Balakirev. Snow fell silently across the towers and walls of the Moscow Kremlin, each flake adding to the thick white blanket that transformed the ancient fortress into a fairy tale palace of ice and shadow. The golden domes of the cathedrals caught what little light filtered through the grey winter sky, their surfaces gleaming like beacons against the gloom. From somewhere within the fortress walls came the deep, resonant sound of bells calling the faithful to vespers, their bronze voices carrying across the frozen city below with a solemnity that seemed to match the season's austere beauty. It was the winter of 1570, and Moscow lay in the grip of both the season and something far more terrible, the reign of Ivan the Terrible, at its darkest and most paranoid phase. The Oprichnina, that dread organization of black-clad horsemen who served as the Tsar's personal enforcers, had transformed the realm into a place where denunciation and sudden death had become routine features of daily life. Noble families that had served the crown for generations found themselves stripped of their lands and titles on the flimsiest of pretexts, while the common people lived in constant fear of the night raids that might see their villages burned and their menfolk carried off to unnamed fates. Yet even in this atmosphere of terror, there were still those brave enough to speak truth to power, though they had to do so with extraordinary care and subtle cunning. Among these few was a figure who had somehow managed to survive and even prosper during Ivan's most murderous years, a man whose position at court was as unique as it was precarious. Balakirev the fool carried no sword and commanded no armies, yet he wielded an influence that even the most powerful boyars envied and feared. His appearance was as unremarkable as his power was extraordinary. A small, thin man with the pale complexion of one who spent his days indoors. Balakirev moved through the palace corridors with the careful steps of someone who had learned that survival often depended on not attracting the wrong kind of attention. His clothes, while well made, were deliberately plain, chosen to suggest prosperity without ostentation, competence without ambition. But it was his eyes that marked him as different from the other. Courtiers, intelligent, watchful, and touched with a kind of weary compassion that spoke of a man who had seen too much human suffering and somehow retained his capacity for empathy. Balakirev's unique position at Ivan's court was built upon a foundation of genuine religious devotion, combined with an almost supernatural understanding of the Tsar's tortured psychology. Ivan IV, for all his cruelty and paranoia, remained fundamentally a believer, a man who saw his actions as part of God's plan for the purification of Russia. This religious conviction was both the source of his greatest crimes and, paradoxically, the only reliable check on his worst impulses. It was this contradiction that Balakirev had learned to exploit with extraordinary skill. Where other advisors appealed to the Tsar's reason or his political interests, Balakirev spoke to his conscience, using parables and riddles that allowed Ivan to examine his own actions without losing face or appearing to accept criticism from a subordinate. It was a dangerous game, one that required perfect timing and absolute trust in one's ability to read the royal mood. But when played successfully, it could achieve results that no amount of conventional diplomacy could match. The most famous example of Balakirev's influence had come during the darkest period of the Oprichnina's reign of terror, when Ivan's paranoia had reached such heights that he was considering the systematic extermination of entire regions suspected of disloyalty. The city of Novgorod, ancient rival of Moscow and proud center of Russian commerce, had fallen under particular suspicion after reports reached the capital of treasonous correspondence with Polish agents. The Tsar's rage, when he learned of these alleged betrayals, had been terrible to behold. He had summoned his commanders and ordered them to prepare for a campaign that would make Novgorod a byword for the consequences of defying royal authority. The city was to be destroyed utterly, its population scattered to the winds, its very name erased from the chronicles of Russian history. It was at this moment, when the machinery of destruction was already in motion, that Balakirev had made his most audacious intervention. He had appeared before the Tsar carrying a simple earthenware bowl filled with honey cakes, the kind of sweet treat that had been Ivan's favorite since childhood. The fool had presented the bowl with a deep bow and had begun to tell what seemed like an innocent story about a beekeeper who had discovered that some of his hives were producing bitter honey. The beekeeper, in Balakirev's tale, had been furious at this discovery, interpreting it as a sign that his bees had become rebellious and ungrateful. In his anger, he had decided to destroy all the hives in his apiary, reasoning that if some bees were corrupt, then all must be tainted by association. But before he could carry out this plan, a wise old monk had visited his apiary and had asked to taste the honey from each hive. What the monk discovered was that only one hive was actually producing bitter honey, and that this was not due to rebellious bees but to a disease that had infected a few flowers in a particular meadow. The other hives were producing honey as sweet as ever, but the beekeeper's anger had blinded him to this truth. The monk had counseled patience and investigation rather than wholesale destruction, and when the beekeeper followed this advice, he discovered that his apiary could be saved with minimal loss. The parable's application to the situation in Novgorod was unmistakable, but Balakirev had told it with such apparent innocence, such obvious devotion to the simple pleasure of sharing honey cakes with his sovereign, that Ivan could not take offense without seeming to admit that he saw himself in the story of the angry beekeeper. Instead, the Tsar had listened thoughtfully, tasting the honey cakes and occasionally asking questions about the details of the story. The next morning, Ivan had announced that he was postponing the Novgorod campaign, pending a more thorough investigation of the treason charges. When that investigation was finally conducted, it revealed that the evidence of Polish correspondence had been fabricated by local officials hoping to curry favor with Moscow by demonstrating their vigilance against foreign influence. The reprieve for Novgorod had been only temporary. Ivan's suspicions would eventually lead to a savage attack on the city several years later, but Balakirev's intervention had saved thousands of lives and had demonstrated the power of well-crafted parables to penetrate even the most paranoid defenses. More importantly, it had established a pattern of influence that would serve the fool well throughout Ivan's reign. Balakirev's survival in this most dangerous of courts was testament to his extraordinary skill at mixing piety, jest, and fearless honesty in precisely the right proportions. He understood that Ivan's religious convictions, however twisted by political necessity and personal paranoia, remained genuine and could be appealed to by someone who spoke the language of faith with obvious sincerity. His performances for the Tsar often took the form of mock sermons delivered in the manner of the holy fools who wandered through Russian cities carrying messages of spiritual truth wrapped in apparent madness. These presentations allowed Balakirev to address the most sensitive political topics while maintaining the protective fiction that he was merely a simple entertainer, sharing folk wisdom and religious instruction. But perhaps his greatest achievement was the way he helped to preserve some fragment of Ivan's humanity during the darkest periods of his reign. The Tsar, isolated by his position and tormented by his own guilt and fear, had found in Balakirev one of the few people who could speak to him as a fellow human being rather than as a political calculation. The fool's presence served as a reminder that beneath the crown and the terrible power it represented was a man who had once been capable of kindness and who might be capable of it again. The influence of this relationship extended far beyond the palace walls. When word spread through Moscow that the Tsar had spared a city because of a story about honey and bees, it reinforced the popular belief that even the most terrible rulers could be reached by appeals to their better nature. This belief, however naive it might seem to modern observers, provided hope to people living under tyranny and helped to maintain the social fabric during periods when brute force alone might have torn it apart. Balakirev's legacy lived on in the rich tradition of Russian political satire, in the stories told by generations of court jesters who followed his example, and in the enduring belief that wisdom and courage could triumph over power and fear. His name became synonymous with the idea that even the humblest subject could influence the course of history through the careful application of wit and moral conviction. When he finally died, sometime in the 1580s, his funeral was attended by representatives of the Orthodox Church, who recognized in him a man who had used his unique position to serve God and his fellow human beings. Ivan himself served as one of the pallbearers, an honor that spoke to the genuine affection and respect the Tsar had felt for the one man at court who had never lied to him or flattered his vanities. The image that lingered in the memories of those who had known Balakirev was not of the clever politician or the skilled entertainer, but of the man of faith, someone who had found in his religious convictions the courage to speak truth to power and the wisdom to do so in ways that might actually be heard and heeded. BIRBAL. The amber twilight of Fatehpur Sikri settled gently over the red sandstone walls of Akbar's magnificent capital, casting long shadows across the courtyards where the greatest minds of the Mughal Empire gathered each evening to debate the mysteries of existence. From somewhere in the distance came the soft strains of a sitar, its melodious voice weaving through the warm air like silk thread through a master weaver's loom. The scent of jasmine and rosewater drifted from the imperial gardens, mingling with the incense that burned perpetually in the palace shrines, creating an atmosphere of almost mystical serenity. It was in this setting, where the architectural grandeur of the Mughals met the intellectual sophistication of the greatest court in 16th century India, that one of history's most remarkable partnerships between ruler and advisor had flourished. The Diwan-e-Khas, Akbar's private audience chamber, glowed softly in the evening light, its central pillar supporting a platform where the Emperor of Hindustan held his most intimate councils. Around this chamber, connected by galleries and bridges that seemed to float in the perfumed air, were the apartments of those chosen few who had earned the right to participate in the daily miracle of Akbar's governance. Among these favored courtiers, one figure stood out not for his noble birth or military prowess, but for the extraordinary combination of wit, wisdom, and moral courage that had elevated him from humble entertainer to one of the most powerful men in the empire. Raja Birbal, born Mahesh Das in a modest Brahmin family, had begun his career at court as nothing more than a clever poet who could improvise verses and solve riddles with unusual skill. But through a combination of genuine talent and the kind of moral intelligence that Akbar valued above all other qualities, he had risen to become not merely the emperor's favorite fool but his grand vizier, the second most powerful person in an empire that stretched from Afghanistan to Bengal. The transformation had been gradual but inevitable, driven by Akbar's recognition that Birbal possessed that rarest of gifts, the ability to speak truth wrapped in humor, to offer guidance disguised as entertainment, and to challenge the emperor's assumptions without threatening his dignity. In a court where sycophancy was the norm and honest counsel a dangerous luxury, Birbal had carved out a unique role as the one person who could make Akbar laugh at his own follies, while simultaneously pointing him toward wiser courses of action. The stories of their interactions had become legendary throughout the empire, passed down through generations of courtiers and eventually entering the rich tradition of Indian folk literature. There was the famous incident of the crows in Agra, when a visiting dignitary had complained that the capital city was overrun with these scavenging birds and had demanded that Akbar do something about the problem. The emperor, always eager to demonstrate his power over even the smallest details of his realm, had summoned Birbal and commanded him to count every crow in the city. The task was, of course, impossible, and any ordinary courtier would have either confessed his inability to complete it or attempted some elaborate deception to avoid the emperor's displeasure. But BIRBAL had approached the problem with characteristic cleverness. The next morning, he had appeared before Akbar and announced that there were exactly 95,463 crows in Agra. When the emperor expressed skepticism about this precise figure, BIRBAL had replied with perfect seriousness that His Majesty was welcome to verify the count. If the actual number was higher than his estimate, it simply meant that crows from neighboring cities had come to visit Agra, drawn by reports of the emperor's magnificence. If the number was lower, it meant that some of Agra's crows had gone to visit their relatives elsewhere. The logic was absurd, but it was delivered with such apparent sincerity and mathematical precision that Akbar had burst into laughter and declared the matter settled. The story, on its surface a simple joke about the impossibility of bureaucratic precision, had deeper implications that were not lost on the more thoughtful members of the court. BIRBAL had demonstrated that some problems could not be solved through the mere application of imperial will, that wisdom sometimes lay in recognizing the limits of power rather than in attempting to extend it indefinitely. The lesson had influenced Akbar's approach to governance in countless subtle ways, encouraging a pragmatic flexibility that became one of the hallmarks of his administration. But perhaps more significantly, the incident had illustrated BIRBAL's genius for using humor to diffuse potentially dangerous situations. The visiting dignitary's complaint had been, in essence, a criticism of Akbar's administration, suggesting that the emperor could not maintain order even in his own capital. By transforming the issue into a source of amusement rather than allowing it to become a test of imperial competence, BIRBAL had protected both his master's dignity and the dignity of the complainer, allowing everyone to save face while avoiding a confrontation that might have had serious political consequences. This talent for diplomatic humor had served the empire well during the complex religious negotiations that marked Akbar's reign. The emperor's policy of sul-i-kul, or universal tolerance, had been one of the most revolutionary aspects of his rule, attempting to create a synthesis of the various religious traditions that coexisted within his vast dominions. But implementing such a policy required extraordinary delicacy, as any perceived favoritism toward one tradition over another could trigger the kind of communal violence that had plagued India for centuries. BIRBAL's role in these religious discussions had been crucial, using his wit to highlight the absurdities of sectarian conflict while simultaneously demonstrating the common ground that existed between different faith traditions. His famous response to a heated debate between Hindu pandits and Muslim clerics exemplified this approach. When the religious scholars had become so entangled in theological minutiae that they were no longer speaking to each other but merely reciting prepared arguments, BIRBAL had interrupted with a simple question. "Learned sirs, can you tell me which is more important to God, the lamp that lights the mosque or the lamp that lights the temple?" The question had forced both sides to acknowledge that divine truth transcended the particular forms through which human beings chose to worship, and the heated argument had gradually transformed into a more productive discussion about the nature of spiritual devotion. This kind of intervention, repeated countless times over the years, had helped to create the atmosphere of intellectual openness that made Akbar's court a magnet for scholars and artists from across the known world. But BIRBAL's influence extended far beyond the rarefied atmosphere of court debate. His impact on actual policy could be seen in the administrative reforms that characterized Akbar's middle period, particularly in the realm of taxation and land revenue. The traditional Mughal system had relied heavily on tax farming, with local officials collecting whatever they could extract from the peasantry and forwarding a portion to the imperial treasury. This system, while efficient in generating short-term revenue, had created enormous hardships for the agricultural population and had contributed to the periodic famines that devastated the countryside. It was BIRBAL who had first suggested to Akbar that a ruler's true wealth lay not in the amount of gold he could extract from his subjects, but in the prosperity of the people themselves. He had illustrated this principle through one of his characteristic stories, this one about a farmer who had discovered a goose that laid golden eggs. The farmer, eager to get rich quickly, had killed the goose to extract all the gold at once, only to discover that the dead bird contained no more treasure than any ordinary fowl. The parable's application to tax policy had been immediately apparent to Akbar, who had begun to experiment with fixed assessments based on the productive capacity of the land rather than on the maximum amount that could be extracted from the cultivators. This reform, implemented gradually over several years, had led to increased agricultural productivity and had provided the economic foundation for the cultural flowering that marked the later years of Akbar's reign. Perhaps the most dramatic example of Birbal's political influence had come during the emperor's decision to undertake a military campaign in Kabul, a venture that would ultimately lead to his death, but that demonstrated his continued importance to imperial policy, even in its most dangerous manifestations. The campaign had been motivated by reports of tribal unrest in the Afghan territories, and several of Akbar's military advisors had recommended a strategy of overwhelming force designed to crush resistance quickly and decisively. But Birbal had counseled a different approach, one that reflected his deep understanding of the cultural and religious sensitivities that motivated the Afghan tribes. Instead of relying purely on military conquest, he had suggested a strategy that combined selective force with generous offers of autonomy and religious freedom for those willing to acknowledge Mughal sovereignty. The approach had required careful coordination between military commanders and civilian administrators, and Birbal had volunteered to accompany the expedition to ensure that the political aspects of the campaign were properly managed. The decision to include the Grand Vizier in what was essentially a military expedition had been controversial, as many courtiers felt that his talents were too valuable to risk in the dangerous conditions of frontier warfare. But Akbar had recognized that Birbal's presence would be essential if the campaign was to achieve its political objectives, and he had accepted the risk as a necessary cost of implementing his chosen strategy. The campaign had initially proceeded according to plan, with several tribal chiefs accepting Mughal terms and agreeing to peaceful incorporation into the empire. But as the expedition penetrated deeper into Afghan territory, it had encountered increasingly fierce resistance from tribes that viewed any foreign presence as an intolerable affront to their independence. It was during one of these encounters, in a narrow mountain pass, where the Mughal forces found themselves surrounded by hostile tribesmen, that Birbal had met his end. According to the accounts that survived, he had died, not as a courtier caught up in military action, but as a soldier, fighting alongside the emperor's guards in a desperate attempt to protect the imperial standard. His death had been mourned throughout the empire, but nowhere more deeply than by Akbar himself, who had lost not merely an advisor, but the closest friend of his adult life. The emperor's grief had been both personal and political, as he recognized that Birbal's death had deprived him of the one person at court who could speak to him with complete honesty. In the years that followed, Akbar would often be heard to say that he had conquered kingdoms but had lost his wisest counselor, and that no amount of territorial expansion could compensate for the absence of a true friend. But Birbal's legacy had extended far beyond his personal relationship with the emperor. His influence could be seen in the religious tolerance that continued to characterize Mughal policy long after his death, in the administrative reforms that had improved the condition of the empire's agricultural population, and in the tradition of witty political commentary that became a permanent feature of Indian court culture. Perhaps most importantly, his story had entered the vast treasury of Indian folk wisdom, where it continued to provide moral instruction for generations of children who learned about the importance of speaking truth to power through the vehicle of seemingly simple stories. The tales of Birbal's cleverness, collected in numerous versions and translated into dozens of languages, had become part of the common cultural inheritance of the subcontinent, teaching lessons about justice, tolerance, and the importance of using one's intelligence in service of the common good. The image that lingered in popular memory was not of the powerful Grand Vizier, but of the humble entertainer who had won an emperor's friendship through the simple expedient of making him laugh, while simultaneously making him think. In that fusion of wisdom and humor, of moral seriousness and playful intelligence, BIRBAL had embodied an ideal of public service that transcended the particular circumstances of his own time and place. TENALI RAMAN. The ancient stones of Hampi lay bathed in silver moonlight, their carved surfaces seeming to come alive in the gentle radiance that transformed the ruins of Vijayanagara into a magical landscape of shadows and dreams. The great bazaar, once the beating heart of one of India's most prosperous kingdoms, stretched endlessly into the darkness, its empty stalls and abandoned pavilions bearing silent witness to glories that had faded but not been forgotten. Above, the stars wheeled in their eternal dance, the same constellations that had looked down upon the Deccan plateau when the empire of Krishna-devaraya had been the wonder of the known world. It was here, in this setting of faded grandeur and enduring beauty, that the memory of one of India's most beloved court jesters lived on in the stories told by village grandmothers and travelling entertainers. TENALI RAMAN, whose very name had become synonymous with wit and wisdom throughout the Telugu-speaking regions of southern India, had once walked these same pathways as a living man, his quick tongue and quicker intelligence serving one of the subcontinent's greatest rulers. The Vijayanagara court of the early 16th century had been a place where the best traditions of Hindu learning and statecraft had flowered under the protection of kings who understood that cultural achievement and political power were inseparably linked. Krishna-devaraya, known to his contemporaries as Andhra Bhoja, in recognition of his patronage of literature and learning, had created an environment where poets and philosophers, artists and administrators could pursue their crafts with a freedom and support that was rare in the turbulent world of medieval India. Into this intellectual paradise had come TENALI RAMAN. Born Galapati Ramakrishnaya in the small town of Tenali, in what is now Andhra Pradesh. His early life had been marked by the kind of precocious intelligence that both delighted and exasperated his teachers, as he demonstrated an almost supernatural ability to find unexpected solutions to apparently simple problems. But it was his gift for wordplay and verbal humor that had first brought him to royal attention, beginning a career that would make him one of the most celebrated figures in the rich tradition of Indian court literature. The king's court at Hampi had been organized around a sophisticated system of literary competitions and intellectual debates that reflected Krishna-devaraya's own passion for learning and his belief that a truly great ruler must surround himself with the finest minds of his age. The court poets, known collectively as the Ashtadhigahas or 8 Elephants, were among the most accomplished scholars in the empire, each one a master of classical Telugu literature and Sanskrit learning. It was into this rarefied company that TENALI RAMAN had been introduced, initially as something of a curiosity, a clever entertainer who could amuse the court with his wit, but who lacked the formal education and noble birth that typically marked membership in the literary elite. But Raman had quickly demonstrated that intelligence and creativity were not the exclusive province of those who had studied in the great centers of learning, and his unconventional perspective had often provided insights that escaped the notice of more traditionally educated scholars. His most famous early triumph had come during a poetry competition in which each of the court poets was challenged to compose verses that would demonstrate both their technical mastery and their understanding of human nature. The other competitors had produced elaborate compositions filled with classical allusions and complex metrical patterns, each one a demonstration of years of study and refinement. But when Raman's turn came, he had recited a simple verse about a farmer who had discovered that his crops grew better when he sang to them while he worked. The poem was deceptively simple in its language and structure, lacking the ornate vocabulary and intricate rhyme schemes that marked classical Telugu poetry. But its deeper meaning that genuine care and attention were more valuable than technical expertise alone had resonated with the king and had established Raman's reputation as a poet who could find profound truths in everyday experiences. This ability to see the extraordinary in the ordinary had become Raman's trademark, and it had served him well as he gradually expanded his role from entertainer to unofficial advisor on matters of both policy and human relations. His influence on King Krishnadevaraya had been subtle but profound, expressed not through formal counsel, but through the kinds of stories and observations that could reshape a ruler's understanding of his responsibilities to his subjects. Perhaps his greatest contribution to the welfare of the kingdom had come during a period of severe drought that had threatened to devastate the agricultural regions that formed the economic foundation of the empire. The traditional response to such crises had been to increase taxation on the remaining productive areas in order to maintain government revenues. But this approach had often led to a vicious cycle in which economic hardship was compounded by administrative pressure. It was Raman who had suggested a different approach, using one of his characteristic stories to illustrate the wisdom of short-term sacrifice in service of long-term prosperity. He had told the king about a merchant who had discovered that his warehouse was infested with rats that were eating his grain supplies. The merchant's first instinct had been to hire cats to kill the rats, but he had quickly realized that the cats were also eating some of his grain and were frightening away the customers who came to buy his goods. The wise merchant had eventually decided to give away some of his grain to the local temple, where it could be distributed to the hungry. This act of apparent generosity had attracted many people to his warehouse, and their presence had naturally driven away the rats while creating a customer base for his remaining inventory. The merchant had lost some of his immediate profits, but he had gained a reputation for generosity that had brought him greater prosperity in the long run. The parable's application to the drought crisis had been clear to Krishnadevaraya, who had ordered a temporary reduction in agricultural taxes, combined with the distribution of grain from the royal granaries to the most severely affected regions. The policy had cost the treasury considerable immediate revenue, but it had prevented the kind of social unrest that might have destabilized the entire kingdom, and it had created a reservoir of popular loyalty that had served the dynasty well in later years. But perhaps Raman's most celebrated intervention in affairs of state had involved his solution to the problem of Portuguese gem smugglers who had been illegally exporting precious stones from the diamond mines that were one of Vijayanagara's most valuable resources. The Portuguese traders, using their superior maritime technology and their connections with corrupt local officials, had been systematically undermining the royal monopoly on diamond exports, costing the treasury enormous sums in lost revenue. The traditional approach to this problem would have been to increase security at the mines and ports, but this would have required significant expenditures for additional guards and administrators, and it would have been only partially effective against smugglers who had already demonstrated their ability to corrupt official personnel. Instead, Raman had proposed a solution that was both more elegant and more effective than conventional enforcement measures. He had suggested that the king announce a new royal policy under which all diamonds found in the kingdom would be considered the personal property of the finder, with the royal treasury purchasing stones at generous prices rather than claiming them as government property. This apparent liberalization of the diamond trade had initially confused both the Portuguese smugglers and the local mining officials, who could not understand why the king would voluntarily give up his monopoly rights. But Raman had understood that the new policy would eliminate the economic incentive for smuggling by making legal sale more profitable than illegal export. The plan had worked brilliantly. Portuguese traders found that they could no longer offer prices competitive with the royal treasury, and local officials no longer had any reason to facilitate smuggling, since the legal trade offered them better opportunities for legitimate profit. Within a year, diamond exports had increased dramatically, royal revenues had reached record levels, and the smuggling problem had virtually disappeared. The success of this policy had demonstrated not only Raman's understanding of economic principles, but also his insight into human psychology. He had recognized that people generally preferred legal to illegal activities when the economic incentives were properly aligned, and that the most effective way to eliminate corruption was often to remove the conditions that made it profitable, rather than simply to punish those who engaged in it. These, and countless other stories, had made Tenali Raman a legendary figure throughout the Telugu-speaking regions of India, where his name became synonymous with the kind of practical wisdom that could solve apparently impossible problems through the creative application of intelligence and imagination. The tales, passed down through generations of storytellers and eventually collected in written form, had become an integral part of the cultural heritage of southern India. But beyond their entertainment value, these stories had served important educational functions, teaching moral lessons about the importance of using one's intelligence in service of justice and the common good. Children who grew up hearing about Raman's exploits learned that cleverness without compassion was mere trickery, and that true wisdom lay in finding solutions that benefited everyone, rather than simply advancing one's own interests. The enduring popularity of these tales had also reflected deeper cultural values about the relationship between rulers and subjects, emphasizing the importance of accessibility and responsiveness in government. The image of a king who would listen to advice from a humble court jester and who would implement policies based on simple stories about farmers and merchants had provided a model of leadership that emphasized service rather than domination. In later centuries, when the great kingdom of Vijayanagara had fallen to Muslim conquerors and the political landscape of southern India had been transformed beyond recognition, the stories of Tenali Raman had continued to provide comfort and inspiration to people struggling with new forms of oppression and uncertainty. The tales had reminded them that intelligence and creativity could triumph over brute force, and that even the humblest individual could influence the course of events through the power of wit and wisdom. Today, as the ruins of Hampi stand in silent testimony to the glories of a vanished civilization, the memory of Tenali Raman lives on in the bedtime stories told by parents throughout the Telugu-speaking world. His legacy is not carved in stone or preserved in official chronicles, but it lives in the laughter of children who learn about the power of clever thinking and the importance of using one's gifts in service of others. The moonlight that bathes the ancient stones of Vijayanagara each night serves as a gentle reminder that some forms of immortality are more enduring than monuments, and that the truest measure of a life well lived may be found not in the power one accumulates, but in the wisdom one shares and the joy one brings to others. MENG. In the twilight of ancient China, when the warring states carved the Middle Kingdom into fragments and painted the landscape with the ambitions of competing dynasties, there stood a courtyard in the capital of Chu where bamboo whispered secrets to the evening wind. The delicate fronds swayed in perfect rhythm, their shadows dancing across stone pathways, worn smooth by centuries of diplomatic feet. Somewhere in the distance, the soft chirping of cicadas provided a gentle counterpoint to the hushed conversations of ministers and scholars who gathered in this sanctuary of learning and statecraft. It was here, in this setting of classical serenity that masked the deadly realities of interstate warfare, that one of history's most remarkable acts of political theatre had unfolded. The year was approximately 300 BCE, and the kingdom of Chu found itself facing a crisis that threatened not merely its prosperity, but its very existence. The armies of Qin, that militaristic state whose discipline and organization had already made it the most feared power in the known world, had been massing on Chu's borders with intentions that required no elaborate interpretation. The situation had reached its most desperate point when envoys from Qin had arrived at the Chu court bearing terms that were, in essence, an ultimatum disguised as a diplomatic proposal. The great state of Chu, heir to centuries of cultural achievement and literary brilliance, was to acknowledge Qin's supremacy and agree to become, in all but name, a vassal kingdom. The alternative, delivered with the cold politeness that characterized Qin diplomacy, was immediate military action that would reduce Chu's cities to ash and its people to slavery. It was in this moment of supreme crisis that MENG, court jester and entertainer, had conceived a plan so audacious that it bordered on madness. MENG was not, by any conventional measure, a man of war or politics. Slight of build and possessed of the kind of quick, nervous energy that marked him as more suited to the performance of comedic sketches than to the great affairs of state, he had made his living through his extraordinary ability to mimic the speech patterns, mannerisms, and physical characteristics of anyone he chose to impersonate. This talent for mimicry had made him a favorite at court entertainments, where his performances provided relief from the constant tension that marked life in a kingdom perpetually threatened by its more powerful neighbors. But MENG had always understood that his gift was more than mere entertainment. It was a form of magic that could transform reality through the power of performance, creating temporary worlds in which the normal rules of social hierarchy and political power could be suspended or reimagined. Now, faced with the greatest crisis in Chu's history, MENG had proposed to use his peculiar talent in service of his kingdom's survival. His plan had been breathtaking in its simplicity and terrifying in its implications. He would impersonate Duke Zhuang, the legendary former ruler of Chu who had died several years earlier, but whose memory remained vivid in the minds of all who had known him. Duke Zhuang had been one of those rare rulers who had combined military prowess with genuine wisdom, a man whose very presence had commanded respect from friend and enemy alike. His death had been mourned not only throughout Chu but even in the courts of rival kingdoms, where his reputation for honor and strategic brilliance had made him a figure of almost mythical stature. MENG's plan had required preparation that was both meticulous and deeply unsettling. For weeks, he had studied every detail of the dead duke's appearance and behavior, consulting with former servants and courtiers who could provide insight into the subtle mannerisms that had marked Zhuang's unique personality. He had practiced the duke's distinctive way of walking, the particular tilt of his head when he was deep in thought, the gestures he had used when addressing crowds or conducting private conversations. But beyond physical mimicry, MENG had immersed himself in the intellectual and emotional world of the dead ruler. He had studied Zhuang's military campaigns, his diplomatic initiatives, his philosophical beliefs, and his personal relationships until he could think and speak as the Duke would have thought and spoken. It was a form of possession that went far beyond mere theatrical performance, a temporary resurrection achieved through the power of imagination and will. When the Qin envoys had been summoned for their final audience with the Chu court, they had found themselves facing not the weak and desperate king they had expected, but the imposing figure of Duke Zhuang himself, apparently returned from the dead to defend his beloved kingdom. MENG's transformation had been so complete, so convincing in every detail, that even members of the Chu court who knew the truth had found themselves wondering if some supernatural intervention had indeed occurred. The psychological impact on the Qin delegation had been immediate and profound. These were men who had been prepared to deal with political desperation, who had anticipated pleas for mercy or perhaps defiant gestures of meaningless resistance. But they had not been prepared to face the legendary Duke Zhuang, whose mere presence had seemed to transform the entire character of the negotiation. Speaking in the Duke's measured tones, and with his unmistakable authority, MENG had addressed the Qin envoys with a mixture of courtesy and barely concealed threat that perfectly captured the diplomatic style that had made Zhuang famous throughout the Chinese world. He had acknowledged Qin's military superiority while simultaneously reminding the envoys of the costs that even a victorious campaign against Chu would entail. More importantly, he had spoken of Chu's alliances with other kingdoms, hinting at military agreements and mutual defense pacts that might or might not have existed, but that suddenly seemed entirely plausible coming from a ruler whose strategic acumen had been legendary. The spectre of a coordinated response from multiple kingdoms, organized and led by the seemingly resurrected Duke Zhuang, had transformed what had appeared to be a simple case of inevitable conquest into a complex strategic calculation with uncertain outcomes. The Qin envoys, faced with this unexpected development, had requested time to consult with their superiors before proceeding with the negotiations. This delay had provided Chu with the breathing space it desperately needed, allowing the kingdom's real diplomatic and military preparations to proceed while the enemy remained uncertain about the true situation. But Yu Meng's performance had achieved something even more significant than mere tactical advantage. It had demonstrated the power of symbol and myth to shape political reality, showing how the memory of greatness could be as potent a weapon as armies or gold. The dead Duke Zhuang, channeled through the extraordinary performance of a humble entertainer, had proven more formidable than any living politician. The incident had also highlighted one of the fundamental principles of Chinese political philosophy, the importance of moral authority as a foundation for effective governance. Yu Meng's impersonation had worked not merely because of his technical skill as a performer, but because Duke Zhuang's reputation for wisdom and integrity had given his words a weight that no amount of military force could match. This understanding of the relationship between moral character and political power had deep roots in Chinese thought, going back to the earliest philosophical traditions that had shaped the development of Chinese civilization. The concept of the mandate of heaven suggested that rulers derived their legitimacy not from mere force, but from their adherence to moral principles, and that even the most powerful dynasty could lose its right to rule if it abandoned the path of virtue. Yu Meng's performance had served as a practical demonstration of these theoretical principles, showing how moral authority could be mobilized in service of political objectives. The Jester's ability to channel the spirit of a dead ruler had been effective precisely because that ruler had earned genuine respect through his character and actions during his lifetime. The episode had also contributed to the development of Chinese theatrical traditions, providing a model for the kind of political satire and social commentary that would become central features of Chinese popular culture. The idea that performers could temporarily assume the identities of historical figures, using their borrowed authority to comment on contemporary events, had influenced generations of entertainers and artists who found in this tradition a relatively safe way to critique existing power structures. But perhaps most significantly, Yu Meng's exploit had become part of the larger Confucian discourse about the proper relationship between rulers and subjects, illustrating the principle that even the humblest individual could serve the cause of justice through courage and creativity. The story had been incorporated into the vast body of moral instruction that shaped Chinese education for centuries, teaching lessons about loyalty, wisdom, and the power of individual action to influence the course of history. In later times, when China had been unified under the imperial system and the Warring States period had become a subject for historical study rather than lived experience, the story of Yu Meng's impersonation had continued to resonate with scholars and officials who faced their own crises of governance. The tale had served as a reminder that effective leadership sometimes required unconventional solutions, and that wisdom could emerge from the most unexpected sources. The image that had lingered in Chinese cultural memory was not of the jester as entertainer, but of the jester as patriot, a man who had risked everything to serve his kingdom in its hour of greatest need. This transformation of a comic performer into a heroic figure had reflected deeper cultural values about the relationship between art and public service, suggesting that the highest purpose of creative talent was to serve the common good. As the bamboo continued to whisper in the evening breeze and the cicadas sang their ancient songs, the memory of Yu Meng's extraordinary performance served as a gentle reminder that the boundaries between reality and illusion, between the living and the dead, between the powerful and the powerless, were far more fluid than they appeared. In the twilight world of political theatre, where truth and fiction dance together like shadows on a wall, even the humblest jester could reshape the destiny of kingdoms through the simple but profound act of becoming someone else. Dongfang SHUO, the palace of Chang'an, stretched endlessly beneath a canopy of silk lanterns that transformed the night sky into a constellation of earthbound stars. Each light, a tiny beacon, casting its warm glow across the marble courtyards and jade-inlaid walkways of the Han imperial residence. The air was perfumed with incense from a dozen different provinces, sandalwood from the southern kingdoms mingling with the crisp pine scent of the northern forests, creating an atmosphere that seemed to embody the vast diversity of the empire itself. In the distance, court musicians played melodies that drifted through the night like whispered secrets, their instruments weaving together the musical traditions of conquered peoples into a harmonious celebration of imperial unity. It was in this setting of almost supernatural magnificence that one of the most extraordinary figures in Chinese history had made his home, a man whose wit and wisdom had earned him a place at the very center of power during one of the most dynamic periods in Chinese civilization. Dongfang SHUO moved through the palace corridors with the confident stride of someone who had long ago mastered the delicate art of being both indispensable and irreverent, a combination that had allowed him to survive and prosper in the dangerous world of imperial politics. The court of Emperor Wu was unlike any that had preceded it in Chinese history. The young emperor, whose reign would eventually span more than half a century and transform the Han dynasty into the greatest power in the known world, had inherited not merely a throne, but a vision of China's destiny that was breathtaking in its scope and ambition. Under his rule, Chinese armies would march to the edges of the known world. Chinese merchants would establish trading posts from Korea to Central Asia, and Chinese culture would spread its influence across a territory larger than the Roman Empire at its height. But this expansion had come at enormous cost, both in human lives and imperial resources, and the court had become a place where the intoxication of power was constantly tempered by the sobering realities of administration and governance. It was a world that demanded both visionary thinking and practical wisdom, both cosmic ambition and mundane attention to detail. Into this complex environment had come Dongfang SHUO, armed with nothing more than his extraordinary intelligence and his unique ability to make even the most serious subjects seem touched with humor. His background was as remarkable as his eventual achievements. Born into a family of modest means in Shandong province, Dongfang SHUO had distinguished himself from an early age through his voracious appetite for learning and his almost supernatural ability to master any subject that captured his interest. By the time he reached adulthood, he had acquired expertise in everything from classical literature and military strategy to astronomy and agricultural science, making him one of the most broadly educated men of his generation. But it was not his learning alone that had brought him to imperial attention. It was his distinctive way of expressing that learning, his ability to wrap profound insights in packages of humor and wordplay that made complex ideas accessible to audiences ranging from peasant farmers to imperial ministers. His written petitions to the emperor had become legendary throughout the capital for their combination of practical wisdom and comic irreverence, documents that somehow managed to be both deeply respectful and gently mocking at the same time. Perhaps his most famous early petition had been his request for appointment to the imperial bureaucracy, a document that had begun with a conventional recitation of his qualifications and accomplishments, but had gradually transformed into something much more unusual. After listing his various areas of expertise, Dongfang SHUO had noted that he was also qualified to serve as the emperor's advisor on matters relating to immortality, as he had recently discovered the secret of eternal life through the consumption of peaches grown in the gardens of the Queen Mother of the West. The petition had gone on to explain, with apparent seriousness, that these magical peaches ripened only once every 3,000 years, and that he had been fortunate enough to acquire several specimens during a recent journey to the Western Mountains. He was prepared to share this remarkable discovery with His Imperial Majesty, but only if he could be assured of a position that would allow him to remain at court long enough to provide proper instruction in the consumption and cultivation of these miraculous fruits. The document had been both absurd and brilliant, demonstrating Dongfang Shuo's understanding of the emperor's well-known fascination with Taoist alchemy and the search for immortality, while simultaneously mocking the pretensions of the countless charlatans and self-proclaimed immortals who regularly appeared at court, claiming to possess such secrets. Emperor Wu, recognizing both the humor and the implicit wisdom of the petition, had granted the appointment and had made Dongfang Shuo one of his most trusted advisors. This relationship had proved beneficial to both men. The emperor had found in Dongfang Shuo someone who could provide honest counsel without threatening his dignity, who could point out the flaws in imperial policies without seeming to challenge imperial authority. For his part, Dongfang Shuo had discovered that his unique combination of learning and humor gave him an influence over policy that was far greater than his official rank would suggest. One of his most significant interventions had come during the great debates over border policy that had dominated the middle years of Emperor Wu's reign. The emperor's aggressive expansion into Central Asia had brought enormous prestige to the dynasty and had opened up lucrative trade routes that connected China to the wealthy kingdoms of the western regions. But these campaigns had also proven enormously expensive, draining the imperial treasury and requiring constant reinforcement with fresh troops and supplies. The debate over whether to continue this expansion had divided the court into competing factions, with military commanders arguing for even more aggressive action, while fiscal administrators counseled consolidation and retrenchment. The discussions had become increasingly heated, with each side presenting elaborate arguments based on historical precedent, strategic analysis, and economic calculation. It was in the midst of one particularly intense debate that Dongfang Shuo had offered his own contribution to the discussion. Rather than presenting another formal analysis of costs and benefits, he had told what appeared to be a simple story about a farmer who had become so successful at growing grain that he had decided to expand his operations by purchasing additional fields in distant valleys. The farmer in Dongfang Shuo's tale had been initially successful in his expansion, producing record harvests that had made him the envy of his neighbors. But as his holdings had grown larger and more scattered, he had found it increasingly difficult to manage his various properties effectively. The cost of transporting seed and tools to distant fields had eaten into his profits, while the time required to travel between his various holdings had prevented him from giving proper attention to any single farm. Eventually, the farmer had realized that his expanded operations were actually less profitable than his original modest holdings had been, and he had decided to sell his distant properties and focus on intensive cultivation of his core lands. The result had been both greater prosperity and greater peace of mind, as he no longer had to worry about managing enterprises that were beyond his effective control. The parable's application to imperial border policy had been unmistakable, and it had provided Emperor Wu with a face-saving way to modify his aggressive expansion without appearing to admit failure. The subsequent retrenchment and consolidation had proven to be one of the wisest decisions of the emperor's reign, allowing the dynasty to digest its conquests and build the administrative infrastructure that would make Han rule in these regions both effective and enduring. But Dongfang Shuo's influence had extended far beyond specific policy debates. His presence at court had helped to establish a tradition of intellectual freedom and creative expression that would become one of the defining characteristics of the Han dynasty. His example had shown that it was possible to serve the throne while maintaining one's intellectual independence, to offer honest counsel while avoiding the twin dangers of sycophancy and rebellion. This tradition of scholarly autonomy had attracted some of the finest minds of the age to imperial service, creating an intellectual environment at the Han court that was unmatched anywhere in the ancient world. Poets and philosophers historians and scientists, had all found in the imperial capital a place where their talents could flourish under royal patronage, while their ideas could develop free from excessive political interference. Dongfang Shuo's own literary productions had played a crucial role in establishing this intellectual climate. His writings, which ranged from political satire to philosophical speculation to scientific observation, had demonstrated that serious scholarship and playful creativity were not merely compatible, but mutually reinforcing. His approach had influenced generations of Chinese intellectuals who had learned from his example that the highest forms of learning were those that could speak to both the mind and the heart. Perhaps his most enduring contribution to Chinese culture had been his role in developing the tradition of cosmic humor that would become one of the distinctive features of Chinese literature and philosophy. His writings had been filled with playful speculation about the nature of the universe, treating the grandest metaphysical questions with a combination of serious inquiry and gentle amusement that had made abstract philosophical concepts accessible to general audiences. This approach had reflected a distinctively Chinese understanding of the relationship between human beings and the cosmos, one that emphasized harmony and proportion rather than conflict and domination. Dongfang Shuo's humor had never been merely destructive or cynical, but had always pointed toward deeper truths about the human condition and humanity's place in the larger scheme of existence. In his later years, as Emperor Wu's reign had drawn toward its close and the court had begun to prepare for the transition to a new ruler, Dongfang Shuo had gradually withdrawn from active involvement in political affairs. But his influence had continued to be felt through the scholars and officials who had learned from his example, and through the literary traditions that he had helped to establish. When he finally died, sometime during the final years of the 1st century BCE, his funeral had been attended by representatives of every intellectual tradition that had flourished during the great age of Han expansion. But perhaps more significantly, his death had been mourned by common people throughout the empire who had never met him, but who had been touched by his writings and by the stories of his wisdom and humor that had spread far beyond the confines of the imperial court. In the centuries that followed, as China had experienced the rise and fall of successive dynasties and the constant transformation of political and social institutions, the memory of Dongfang Shuo had endured as a symbol of the possibility for intellectual independence within the framework of imperial service. His eventual deification as a god of literature and jest had reflected the deep respect that Chinese culture had maintained for the kind of creative intelligence that he had embodied. The image that had remained fixed in Chinese cultural memory was of a man who had walked confidently through the halls of ultimate power while never losing his sense of humor or his connection to the common experiences of humanity. In the silk-slippered elegance of his movements through the palace of Chang'an, in the twinkling intelligence of his eyes as he composed another impossible petition for imperial consideration, in the gentle wisdom of his voice as he offered counsel disguised as entertainment, Dongfang Shuo had embodied an ideal of scholarship and service that continued to inspire Chinese intellectuals long after the lanterns of the Han court had been extinguished forever. NASREDDIN HODJA, the scent of fresh bread and honey cakes, drifted through the narrow streets of Konya as the evening call to prayer echoed across the ancient Anatolian city, its melodic Arabic syllables weaving through the warm air like invisible silk threads connecting earth to heaven. The sun was setting behind the distant mountains, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose that reflected off the glazed tiles of mosque domes and the weathered stones of caravanserai walls. This was the hour when the day's business gave way to evening contemplation, when merchants closed their shops and gathered in coffee houses to share the news that had arrived with the latest caravan from Damascus or Baghdad. It was in this timeless setting, where the rhythms of Islamic civilization had remained unchanged for centuries, that the most beloved figure in Turkish folklore had walked the dusty streets and marketplaces, his presence bringing laughter to a world that often seemed too serious for its own good. Whether Nasreddin HODJA had been a single historical figure or a composite creation drawn from the collective wisdom of countless Anatolian storytellers was a question that scholars had debated for generations. But the debate itself had always seemed to miss the point. The stories were true in ways that transcended mere historical accuracy, capturing essential truths about human nature and divine providence that spoke to the hearts of believers and skeptics alike. The tales of Nasreddin HODJA had spread far beyond their Anatolian origins, carried by merchants and pilgrims along the trade routes that connected the Islamic world from Spain to Central Asia. Each culture that had encountered these stories had adapted them to its own circumstances and concerns, but the essential character of the HODJA had remained constant. A man of genuine piety and considerable learning who nevertheless possessed an almost childlike ability to see through the pretensions and absurdities that marked human behavior in every age and culture. His most famous adventure had involved his donkey, that patient creature whose relationship with its master had become a symbol of the complex dance between wisdom and folly that characterized the human condition. According to the story that was told in coffee houses from Istanbul to Isfahan, the HODJA had been traveling to a nearby village when he had encountered a group of people who began to mock him for riding while his son walked alongside. "Look at that selfish old man," they had said, "forcing his poor child to walk while he rides in comfort. What kind of father treats his son so badly?" Embarrassed by their criticism, the HODJA had dismounted and had insisted that his son ride while he walked. But they had not traveled far before encountering another group of travelers who had their own opinions about the arrangement. "What's wrong with that boy?" these new critics had demanded. "How can he sit comfortably on his donkey while his elderly father struggles along on foot? Young people today have no respect for their elders." Confused and increasingly frustrated, the HODJA and his son had decided to both walk alongside the donkey, thinking that this would surely satisfy everyone. But the next group of travelers they had met had found this arrangement even more ridiculous. "Look at those two fools," they had laughed, "walking in the dust when they have a perfectly good donkey that could carry them. They must be the most stupid people in Anatolia." Finally, in desperation, both father and son had climbed onto the poor donkey's back, only to be confronted by yet another group of critics who had accused them of cruelty to animals. "That poor beast can barely carry one person, and here they are both riding it like a pair of inconsiderate bullies." The story had concluded with the HODJA's famous realization that it was impossible to please everyone, and that a man who tried to live his life according to the opinions of others would end up pleasing no one, least of all himself. The tale had become a staple of Islamic moral instruction, teaching lessons about the importance of following one's own conscience rather than bowing to social pressure. But it had also served subtler purposes in the complex world of Islamic politics and society. For the story of the donkey had been, among other things, a gentle critique of the tendency toward excessive religious and social conformity that had sometimes characterized Islamic civilization. In a culture where community harmony and shared values were highly prized, the HODJA's adventures had provided a safe way to question whether the price of such harmony might sometimes be too high, whether the pressure to conform might sometimes prevent people from thinking for themselves or acting according to their own understanding of divine will. But perhaps the most significant of the HODJA's legendary exploits had been his role in the great irrigation project that had transformed the agricultural region around Konya during the 13th century. According to the traditional account, the local farmers had been struggling with a severe drought that had threatened to destroy their crops and leave their families facing starvation. The usual prayers and religious observances had failed to bring rain, and the community had begun to despair of finding any solution to their crisis. It was then that the HODJA had proposed an unusual solution, one that had seemed to combine practical engineering with mystical insight in a way that was characteristically both sensible and absurd. He had suggested that the community pool its resources to purchase an enormous vat, larger than any container that had ever been seen in the region, and that this vat should be filled with yogurt and placed in the town square. The proposal had initially been met with skepticism and even ridicule. What possible good could come from filling a giant vat with yogurt? How could such an action address the serious problem of drought and crop failure? But the HODJA had explained his reasoning with the kind of logic that was both perfectly clear and completely incomprehensible. If we have enough yogurt to fill such a large vat, he had argued, then surely we must also have enough milk to create that yogurt. And if we have enough milk, then we must have enough cows to produce that milk. And if we have enough cows, then we must have enough pasture to feed those cows. And if we have enough pasture, then we surely have enough water to irrigate our fields. The reasoning was circular and absurd, but it had contained a grain of practical wisdom that the more thoughtful members of the community had begun to recognize. The project of creating and filling the vat had required unprecedented cooperation between families and villages that had previously worked in isolation. The process of organizing such a massive undertaking had forced the community to take inventory of its actual resources and to think creatively about how those resources might be better utilized. More importantly, the shared effort had created a sense of common purpose and mutual obligation that had made other forms of cooperation possible. When the VAT project had been completed, the community had discovered that it possessed not only the technical skills, but also the social cohesion necessary to undertake more practical irrigation projects that could actually address their water shortage problems. The story of the yogurt vat had become one of the most beloved tales in the HODJA cycle, but it had also served as an influential model for community organization throughout the Ottoman Empire. Local officials and religious leaders had used variations of the story to encourage cooperation on public works projects, from the construction of bridges and roads to the establishment of schools and hospitals. The HODJA's influence on Ottoman governance had extended far beyond such local initiatives. However, his stories had become a kind of informal curriculum in practical wisdom that had shaped the thinking of administrators and judges throughout the empire. The tales had provided a repository of examples and precedents that could be drawn upon when dealing with the countless disputes and problems that arose in governing a diverse population spread across 3 continents. Ottoman viziers and judges had often cited HODJA stories when crafting legal decisions or policy recommendations, using the familiar tales to illustrate principles of justice and good governance in ways that would be readily understood by both educated officials and common citizens. The stories had served as a bridge between the formal structures of Islamic law and the practical realities of everyday life, providing guidance that was both religiously sound and pragmatically effective. Perhaps most importantly, the HODJA stories had helped to establish a tradition of gentle skepticism toward authority that had served as a check on the potential abuses of imperial power. While never directly challenging the legitimacy of Ottoman rule or Islamic law, the tales had consistently questioned the pretensions of officials who took themselves too seriously or who forgot that wisdom and humility were more valuable than rank and title. This tradition of humorous critique had provided Ottoman society with a valuable safety valve, allowing popular frustrations to be expressed in ways that were both entertaining and politically safe. The ability to laugh at authority, even when that laughter had to be carefully disguised, had helped to maintain social stability during periods of political crisis and economic hardship. The enduring popularity of the HODJA stories had also reflected deeper aspects of Islamic spirituality, particularly the tradition of finding divine truth in the most ordinary circumstances and everyday experiences. The HODJA's adventures had consistently demonstrated that spiritual insight was not the exclusive province of formal religious authorities, but could be discovered by anyone who approached life with the right combination of openness, humility, and careful attention to the world around them. In later centuries, as the Ottoman Empire had declined and the Islamic world had been forced to confront the challenges of modernity and Western influence, The HODJA stories had continued to provide comfort and guidance to people struggling to maintain their cultural identity in the face of rapid change. The tales had offered a model of how traditional wisdom could be preserved and transmitted even in the most difficult circumstances, and how humor and storytelling could serve as powerful tools for cultural survival. Today, as the call to prayer continues to echo across the ancient streets of Konya and the scent of fresh bread continues to drift from neighborhood bakeries, the memory of Nasreddin HODJA lives on in the laughter of children who learn his stories, and in the quiet wisdom of adults who apply his lessons to their own struggles with the eternal human challenges of living wisely and faithfully in an often confusing world. The image that remains most vivid in the collective memory is that of the HODJA riding his donkey backward, facing the road he has traveled rather than the path ahead. A posture that seems absurd until one realizes that it represents a profound truth about the relationship between memory and hope, between learning from experience and trusting in divine providence. In that gentle reversal of normal expectations, in that willingness to see the world from an unexpected angle, lies the essence of the wisdom that has made Nasreddin HODJA one of the most beloved figures in human folklore, a teacher whose lessons transcend the boundaries of culture, religion, and time. Geoffrey Hudson. The campfires of Edgehill flickered like fallen stars across the Warwickshire countryside, their orange flames casting dancing shadows on the faces of men who had learned to sleep with their weapons close at hand and their prayers closer still. The autumn of 1642 had brought civil war to England, dividing families and friendships with a brutality that seemed to mock the gentle landscape where these terrible divisions were being fought out with sword and musket. In the distance, the smoke from burned villages hung in the still air like accusatory fingers, pointing toward a heaven that seemed to have abandoned this green and pleasant land to the fury of its own children. Among the royalist encampment, where the banners of King Charles I snapped proudly in the evening breeze, moved a figure so unlikely that enemy scouts who glimpsed him from afar often dismissed their own reports as the products of exhaustion or wishful thinking. Geoffrey Hudson stood barely 18 inches tall, his miniature frame encased in perfectly fitted armor that gleamed like silver in the firelight. His horse, a specially selected pony that brought him closer to normal height when mounted, pranced beneath him with the kind of spirited energy that seemed to mirror its rider's irrepressible determination to prove that courage had nothing to do with physical stature. The sight of this tiny cavalier preparing for battle alongside the flower of English nobility would have been merely curious in peacetime, but in the desperate circumstances of civil war, it had become something approaching miraculous. Geoffrey Hudson was no mere curiosity or court entertainment, was a symbol of the kind of fierce personal loyalty that had brought men from every corner of the kingdom to fight and die for their conception of what England should be. His journey to this moment had been extraordinary, even by the standards of an age that seemed to specialize in the impossible. Born in Rutland to parents of normal stature, Geoffrey had been marked from birth by the kind of physical differences that might have condemned him to a life of isolation and mockery. But fortune, or perhaps divine providence, had intervened in the person of the Duke of Buckingham, who had discovered the remarkable child and had recognized in his quick intelligence and spirited personality something far more valuable than mere novelty. The famous incident that had brought Geoffrey to royal attention had become one of the most celebrated stories of Charles I's court. During a grand banquet at Burley-on-the-Hill, the Duke of Buckingham had arranged for an enormous pie to be carried into the dining hall, its crust golden and perfectly formed, its size so impressive that it had drawn gasps of admiration from the assembled guests. But when the pie had been cut open, instead of the expected game birds or exotic delicacies, out had stepped Geoffrey Hudson, dressed in a miniature suit of silk and carrying himself with the dignity of a prince. The spectacle had delighted Queen Henrietta Maria, who had immediately claimed Geoffrey as her own, and had granted him a position in the royal household that was both genuine and unprecedented. Unlike the traditional court dwarfs who had served as living toys for the amusement of their betters, Geoffrey had been treated as a person of worth and intelligence, given a real education and real responsibilities that had allowed his natural talents to flourish. But it was the outbreak of civil war that had truly revealed the depth of Geoffrey's character and the strength of his commitment to the royal cause. When King Charles had raised his standard at Nottingham and had called upon all loyal subjects to rally to the defense of the crown, Geoffrey had not hesitated to answer that call. Despite his physical limitations, or perhaps because of them, he had insisted on serving not as a mascot or entertainer, but as a genuine soldier, ready to face the same dangers and accept the same responsibilities as any other member of the royal army. His presence in the royalist ranks had provided a morale boost that went far beyond what might have been expected from his military contributions. The sight of this tiny figure in his gleaming armor, absolutely fearless in the face of enemy fire, had become a powerful symbol of the kind of personal devotion that the king's cause could inspire. If Geoffrey Hudson, who owed nothing to birth or breeding, could risk everything for his sovereign, how could men of noble blood do any less? The practical challenges of integrating someone of Geoffrey's stature into military operations had required considerable creativity and adaptation. Special equipment had been commissioned, including not only his perfectly fitted armor, but also weapons scaled to his size and strength. His horse had been selected and trained with extraordinary care, chosen not only for its manageable size, but also for its steady temperament and reliability under fire. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Geoffrey's military service had been his absolute refusal to accept any special consideration or protection because of his physical differences. He had insisted on sharing the same dangers as his comrades, on sleeping in the same rough conditions, and on accepting the same risks that came with cavalry service in an age when a single musket ball could end a life in an instant. This determination had been put to its ultimate test during the chaos of the Battle of Edgehill itself, when the careful plans of both armies had dissolved into the kind of confused melee that characterized so many Civil War engagements. Geoffrey had found himself separated from his unit during a cavalry charge, surrounded by parliamentary horsemen who had initially been too astonished by his appearance to react with their usual efficiency. It was then that Geoffrey had demonstrated the kind of quick thinking and physical courage that had made him beloved throughout the royalist army. Using his small size to his advantage, he had maneuvered his pony between the legs of the enemy horses, creating confusion and panic among riders who had never encountered such an unusual opponent. His sword, though smaller than those carried by normal-sized cavalrymen, had been wielded with deadly precision, and he had fought his way clear of the enemy circle through a combination of skill, determination, and sheer audacity. The incident had become legendary throughout both armies, with even parliamentary soldiers expressing grudging admiration for the tiny royalist who had refused to surrender despite being hopelessly outnumbered. The story had spread through the coffee houses and taverns of London, where Geoffrey Hudson had become a symbol of the romantic gallantry that many associated with the king's cause, even among those who opposed it politically. But Geoffrey's adventures had extended far beyond the battlefields of the English Civil War. His capture by Barbary pirates during a diplomatic mission to France had provided him with experiences that would have been remarkable for any traveler, but that were particularly extraordinary for someone of his unique circumstances. The pirates, initially uncertain how to categorize their unusual prisoner, had eventually decided to treat him as a valuable curiosity who might command a substantial ransom from European collectors. His time in captivity had lasted several years and had exposed him to a world that few Europeans of his era had ever seen. The corsair ports of North Africa had been cosmopolitan places where the cultures of the Mediterranean world had mingled in ways that were both fascinating and terrifying to someone raised in the relative insularity of English court society. Geoffrey had learned Arabic, had studied Islamic customs and beliefs, and had gained insights into the complex political and commercial networks that connected North Africa to the broader Islamic world. His eventual ransom and return to Europe had been celebrated throughout the courts of Christendom, where his adventures had been recounted in pamphlets and broadsheets that had made him one of the most famous men of his generation. But the experience had also changed him in subtle ways, giving him a perspective on cultural difference and religious diversity that was unusual for his time and social position. The later years of Geoffrey's life had been marked by a series of increasingly dramatic incidents that had cemented his reputation as one of the most remarkable figures of his age. His famous duel with a much larger opponent had become the subject of countless retellings, each version emphasizing different aspects of the encounter, but all agreeing on the essential fact that Geoffrey had refused to back down from a challenge despite the obvious physical disadvantages he faced. The duel itself had been fought according to the strict codes of honor that governed such encounters among gentlemen, with Geoffrey insisting on using the same weapons and following the same rules that would have applied to any other participant. His victory, achieved through superior speed and agility rather than brute strength, had been hailed as a triumph of courage over circumstance and had further enhanced his reputation for bravery and determination. But beyond his individual exploits, Geoffrey Hudson had served a larger symbolic function in the propaganda wars that had accompanied the military conflicts of his era. His unwavering loyalty to the royal cause had been used by royalist writers and pamphleteers as evidence that the king's authority transcended the artificial distinctions of birth and breeding that marked conventional society. If someone as obviously different as Geoffrey Hudson could find a place of honor and respect in the royal service, it suggested that the monarchy represented a more inclusive and meritocratic institution than its parliamentary opponents claimed. This symbolic role had been particularly important during the darkest periods of the Civil War, when the king's forces had been struggling to maintain morale in the face of military defeats and political setbacks. The image of Geoffrey Hudson fighting fearlessly for his sovereign had provided a powerful counter-narrative to the parliamentary claim that the royal cause was supported only by a narrow elite of aristocratic parasites who cared nothing for the welfare of ordinary English people. At the same time, Geoffrey's story had highlighted some of the more troubling aspects of early modern attitudes toward physical difference and social hierarchy. His treatment as a living spectacle, however affectionate and respectful it might have been, had reflected the period's tendency to view people with disabilities as curiosities rather than as full human beings, entitled to dignity and respect. Yet Geoffrey himself had consistently transcended these limitations, using his position and his fame to advocate for others who faced similar challenges, and to demonstrate through his own example that physical differences need not prevent someone from living a full and meaningful life. His insistence on being treated as a genuine soldier rather than as a mascot had helped to establish precedents that would influence attitudes toward disability and military service for generations to come. When Geoffrey finally died, well into the Restoration period, his funeral had been attended by representatives of every social class and political faction, a testament to the extraordinary respect he had earned through his courage, determination, and unwavering commitment to his principles. His life had spanned some of the most tumultuous decades in English history, and he had participated in events that had shaped the development of British political institutions and cultural values. The image that lingered in popular memory was of the tiny cavalier in his gleaming armor, mounted on his faithful pony, ready to charge into battle alongside the greatest nobles of the realm. In that image, vulnerability and strength had been perfectly balanced, creating a symbol of human resilience that transcended the particular circumstances of 17th century political conflict. Geoffrey Hudson had proven that heroism came in all sizes, and that the measure of a person's worth lay not in their physical attributes, but in the courage and loyalty they brought to the causes they chose to serve. Richard Tarlton. The shutters of the Globe Theatre closed with a soft whisper against the London twilight, their weathered wood seeming to exhale the day's accumulated laughter and applause into the gathering dusk. Beyond the theatre walls, the Thames lapped gently against the muddy banks of Southwark, its dark waters carrying the detritus of the greatest city in Christendom toward the open sea. The air was thick with the smoke from countless hearth fires and the richer aromas of roasting meat and ale that marked the end of another day in the entertainment district that had become the beating heart of English popular culture. Inside the theatre's empty galleries, where only hours before the groundlings had roared their approval and the genteel occupants of the boxes had applauded with more restrained enthusiasm, a solitary figure moved through the shadows like a ghost, visiting the scenes of his former triumphs. Richard Tarlton was no longer the spry young comedian who had first captured London's imagination with his quick wit and lightning-fast improvisations, but age had done nothing to diminish the intelligence that sparkled in his eyes or the theatrical instincts that had made him the most beloved performer of his generation. The candle-lit rehearsal space beneath the main stage had become his sanctuary in these twilight years, a place where he could work undisturbed on the new material that continued to flow from his inexhaustible imagination. Tonight, as on so many nights before, he was crafting the kind of topical verses that had made him famous throughout the realm, doggerel that seemed simple on the surface, but that carried layers of meaning for those clever enough to decode them. Tarlton's rise to prominence had coincided with the flowering of English theatre during the early years of Elizabeth I's reign, that golden age when playwriting had transformed from a crude craft, practiced by travelling minstrels, into an art form capable of exploring the deepest mysteries of human nature. But while his contemporaries like Christopher Marlowe and the young William Shakespeare had focused their talents on the lofty realms of tragedy and history, Tarlton had chosen to work in the more humble but equally important medium of popular comedy. His genius had lain not in the creation of elaborate plots or profound characters, but in his ability to read the mood of his audience and to respond instantaneously with material that spoke directly to their immediate concerns and anxieties. He had been, in essence, a living newspaper, someone who could take the complex political and social currents of Elizabethan England and transform them into entertainment that was both amusing and enlightening. The technique he had perfected was known as extemporizing, the art of creating verses and comic scenes on the spot in response to suggestions from the audience. A spectator might call out a topic or a situation, and within moments Tarlton would be performing a complete comic sketch that not only addressed the specific request, but also managed to comment on larger issues of the day. The skill required was extraordinary, demanding not only quick wit and theatrical talent, but also an encyclopedic knowledge of current events and popular culture. But perhaps his most significant contribution to English political discourse had come during the anxious years when the Spanish Armada had been gathering in the ports of Cadiz and Lisbon, preparing for the invasion that would either restore Catholic rule to England or confirm Elizabeth's Protestant settlement once and for all. The mood in London during this period had been a complex mixture of patriotic defiance and genuine terror, as even the most optimistic observers had understood that England's survival hung in the balance. It was during these dark months that Tarlton's impromptu performances had taken on a significance that went far beyond mere entertainment. His doggerel verses about Spanish pretensions and Catholic plots had helped to shape public opinion in ways that formal government propaganda could never have achieved. Where official proclamations had spoken in the elevated language of statecraft and theology, Tarlton had addressed his audiences in the vernacular of the London streets, using humour and ridicule to transform fear into confidence and anxiety into determination. His most famous performance during this period had been his mock sermon on the text, "Pride goeth before a fall," delivered in the character of a Spanish priest who had come to England to claim his share of the wealth that would surely flow from the conquest of the heretical English. The character had been a masterpiece of satirical observation, combining genuine knowledge of Catholic theology and Spanish political ambitions with the kind of buffoonish exaggeration that made complex political issues accessible to audiences who might never have read a book or heard a formal political speech. The performance had been so successful so perfectly pitched to capture the prevailing mood of defiant humor that had characterized London's response to the Spanish threat, that it had been repeated night after night to packed houses. More importantly, it had been copied and adapted by other performers throughout the realm, spreading Tarleton's particular brand of patriotic comedy far beyond the confines of the London theatre world. The impact of this cultural campaign had been measurable in the changed atmosphere that had characterized public discourse about the Spanish threat. Where earlier discussions had been marked by anxiety and uncertainty, Tarleton's ridicule had helped to create a climate of confident mockery that had made the Spanish enterprise seem not only dangerous, but also absurd. The psychological effect had been crucial in maintaining English morale during the months of preparation that had preceded the actual invasion attempt. But Tarleton's influence had extended beyond the immediate crisis of the Armada to encompass the broader development of English dramatic literature. His techniques of improvisation and audience interaction had provided a model that had influenced the greatest playwrights of the age, including the young William Shakespeare, who had incorporated many of Tarleton's innovations into his own comic scenes and characters. The connection between Tarleton and Shakespeare had been more than merely professional. It had been, in many ways, a direct artistic inheritance that could be traced through specific characters and dramatic techniques. The gravedigger scene in Hamlet, with its mixture of humor and philosophical reflection, had owed a clear debt to Tarleton's ability to find profound truths in apparently trivial situations. More broadly, Shakespeare's fool characters from Touchstone in As You Like It to the Fool in King Lear had all been variations on the archetype that Tarleton had perfected through years of performance and refinement. This influence had been particularly evident in the creation of Yorick, the dead jester, whose skull had provided Hamlet with an occasion for meditation on mortality and the transience of human achievement. The character had been, in many ways, a tribute to Tarleton himself, whose own mortality had reminded Shakespeare and his contemporaries that even the most brilliant performers were subject to the same universal fate that awaited all human beings. But perhaps Tarleton's most lasting contribution to English culture had been his role in preserving and transmitting the oral traditions of popular humor that might otherwise have been lost in the transition from medieval to modern England. His jokes and comic routines had been collected and published in cheap pamphlets that had circulated throughout the kingdom, creating a body of popular literature that had provided a foundation for generations of subsequent entertainers. These publications had served multiple functions in English society. They had provided entertainment for the growing population of literate citizens who could not regularly attend theatrical performances. They had preserved comic material that could be adapted and reused by traveling performers, and they had helped to establish a common national culture that transcended regional differences in dialect and custom. The jokes themselves had often been surprisingly sophisticated in their social and political commentary, using humor to address issues that might have been dangerous to discuss directly. Tarleton's satirical portraits of corrupt officials, pretentious nobles, and hypocritical clerics had provided his audiences with a way to express their frustrations with authority, while maintaining the protective fiction that they were merely enjoying harmless entertainment. This tradition of satirical commentary had become one of the defining characteristics of English popular culture, influencing everything from the political cartoons of the 18th century to the satirical television programs of the modern era. Tarleton's example had shown that humor could be both a form of entertainment and a tool of social criticism, a way of speaking truth to power while avoiding the direct confrontation that might provoke retaliation. In his final years, as illness and age had begun to limit his ability to perform with his former energy and spontaneity, Tarleton had increasingly focused his attention on mentoring younger performers and on recording the techniques and material that he had developed over his long career. His workshop beneath the Globe Theatre had become a kind of informal academy where aspiring comedians could learn the skills that had made their mentor famous. These teaching sessions had been characterized by the same improvisational energy that had marked Tarleton's public performances, with the master performer constantly adapting his instruction to the particular talents and limitations of his students. He had understood that comedy was not a set of rules to be memorized, but a living art form that required constant innovation and adaptation to changing circumstances. When Richard Tarleton finally died, in the winter of 1588, his funeral had been attended by representatives of every level of English society, from court officials who had appreciated his contributions to national morale, to common laborers, who had found in his performances a few moments of relief from the hardships of daily life. But perhaps the most fitting tribute had been the decision of his fellow performers to continue his tradition of topical improvisation, ensuring that his particular form of democratic entertainment would survive to influence future generations. The image that had remained fixed in popular memory was of Tarleton in his prime, standing alone on the bare stage of an Elizabethan theatre, his quick eyes reading the faces of his audience as he crafted verses that would make them laugh while making them think. In that moment of perfect connection between performer and audience, between art and life, between individual creativity and collective experience, Richard Tarleton had embodied the democratic spirit that would become one of the defining characteristics of English culture in the centuries to come.